There is a book, almost 2,000 years old, that billionaires, Navy SEALs, and every person who has ever faced the worst night of their life has turned to. And the man who wrote it was falling apart when he wrote it. Marcus Aurelius didn't write the Meditations from a place of calm. He wrote them from the front lines of war during a plague that killed 5 million of his citizens. From a camp surrounded by enemies who wanted to kill him. From a throne he never wanted. He had stood at the edge of the Roman Empire and looked out into the darkness. And he had been afraid. But he found a way to silence the fear and the relentless noise of his own mind. Not once, not in some grand philosophical breakthrough. Every single night. He found a way to reach inside the chaos and pull out something solid to hold on to. And he wrote it down. Not for us. Not because he wanted to be remembered. He wrote it down because it was the only thing that kept him sane. What he wrote changed the way we treat fear and anxiety to this day. And most people don't even know it. This is the story of Marcus Aurelius. This is the story of a man who outlasted everything. Tonight, you'll hear the words he whispered to himself to survive. And by morning, you might find yourself whispering them too. Welcome, nightlings. This is Huxley. If you like listening or falling asleep to real stories that reveal life's deeper truths, then this is the place for you. Consider subscribing and let the next story find you when you need it most. Quick question. I'm curious. Do you dream in color? Black and white? Or maybe you never remember your dreams? Let me know in the comments. I personally dream in black and white, but on rare occasions, in color. Before we begin, I want to share something genuinely useful with you. Studies on sleep and anxiety have found that one of the most effective ways to stop the nighttime thought spiral is to physically write down your worries before bed. Not to solve them, just to write them down. What happens neurologically is fascinating. By externalizing the thought and giving it a container, the page, you activate a different mode of processing. It shifts from rumination, circular, emotional, exhausting, to something closer to problem-solving mode. The brain registers that the thought has been captured, and it becomes a little quieter, a little less urgent. Marcus Aurelius did this every night. We have the pages to prove it. So if you keep a notebook nearby, or even your phone with the Notes app open, try it tonight. Write down whatever's circling. You don't have to know what to do about it. Just give it a home that isn't your head. Now, settle in, take a deep breath, and let's begin. The Danube is frozen from bank to bank. 3 feet of ice, strong enough to hold a cavalry charge. And that is exactly what Marcus Aurelius is afraid of. Because on the other side, somewhere in the dark pines, somewhere in the silence that's been pressing against the Roman camp for 6 days, the Marcomanni are waiting. 12,000 warriors, maybe more. The scouts stopped coming back 2 days ago. Marcus stands at the edge of the camp. He's 57 years old. His stomach hasn't kept food down in weeks. His personal physician has been giving him theriac, opium and viper flesh, just to keep him standing. The general beside him leans close. "Caesar, they'll cross at dawn. What are your orders?" Marcus looks at the frozen river, but he isn't thinking about the river. He's thinking about a question. Not about Rome, not about the Danube. He is thinking about a question he has spent his entire life trying to answer. How do you stop being afraid of what comes next? Because here it is. Next. The thing that frightened him as a boy when they told him he'd be emperor. The thing that woke him at 3 a.m. for 58 years. The thing that all his philosophy, all those years of writing and thinking and revising and rewriting, was trying, in some fundamental way, to address. He has more answers now than he did at the beginning. That much he knows. He reaches for his journal. He has been keeping this journal for years, decades really, adding to it whenever he could. Notes to himself, reminders, corrections of his own thinking. It is messy and repetitive and deeply, achingly human. It was never meant to be a masterpiece. It was meant to be a practice. He opens it, reads the last line he wrote. "You could leave life right now. Let that determine what you do and say and think." He closes the book. But to understand what happens next, what Marcus Aurelius decides in this fateful moment, we have to drift back. If these stories speak to you, if you find comfort in the lessons that live in the quiet corners of history, tap the follow button and join our circle of dreamers. Let the next story find you when you need it most. He was born in the wrong place, not physically. Physically, he was born in one of the most comfortable addresses in the ancient world, a mansion on the Caelian Hill in Rome, one of the city's 7 famous hills, in the household of a family so established, so wealthy, so well connected that prominent would be an understatement. The Annius Verus family was the kind of family that Rome was built for. They had everything. Marcus Annius Verus, born April the 26th, 121 AD, had everything except a father. His father, Marcus Annius Verus III, died when the boy was 3 years old. 3. Whatever memories Marcus might have carried of the man were impressions mostly, a shape in a doorway, a voice, the feeling of being held, nothing solid enough to hold on to. His mother, Domitia Lucilla, was extraordinary in her own right. She was one of the wealthiest women in Rome, a fact that was somewhat unusual even for an aristocratic family, because the wealth was hers, not her husband's. She had inherited brick and tile factories from her family that supplied construction across the empire. She was educated, sharp, well-read, and by all accounts deeply devoted to the strange, solemn little boy who was now her responsibility. And the boy, well, the boy was unusual. He was serious in a way that made adults uncomfortable. Not unhappy exactly, but grave, as though he were always working something out just behind his eyes. He was gentle. He was quiet. He preferred books to games, philosophy to performance, the company of his tutors to the company of children his own age. And he slept on the floor. This is one of those details that historians mention in passing, but I want you to sit with it for a moment, because it tells you a great deal. Here is a boy born into unimaginable wealth, growing up in a mansion on a fashionable hill, in the capital of the greatest empire on earth, and he is choosing to sleep on the floor. on a hard wooden floor because he has read about the Stoic philosophers and their emphasis on discomfort, on not being enslaved to luxury, on training the body not to need what it doesn't need. He was, by most accounts, 7 or 8 years old when he started doing this. His mother eventually convinced him to compromise. He'd sleep on a couch, she said, a simple one, with animal skins for warmth, because the Roman winters on the Caelian hill were not gentle. He agreed to the couch. He kept the skins. He thought about it as a negotiated settlement. He was perhaps the most philosophical 8-year-old in history. The Emperor Hadrian noticed him early. Of course, Hadrian noticed him. Hadrian was not a man who missed things, and this boy had the quality of drawing attention without seeking it, which is the rarest kind of attention drawing there is. When Marcus was 6 years old, Hadrian enrolled him in the equestrian order, the Roman equivalent of being recognized as gentry. It was an honor usually reserved for adults. At age 8, Marcus was initiated into the College of the Salii. Now, the Salii were the priests of Mars, the war god, and their primary ritual obligation was to perform a ceremonial dance through the streets of Rome during the festival season. Picture it, young Marcus Aurelius, this solemn, floor-sleeping, philosophy-reading boy, donning the ritual costume, and then dancing through the streets of Rome. There is something deeply, wonderfully human about this image. The future emperor, one of the greatest Stoic philosophers who ever lived, doing a ritual war dance through the Forum. Hadrian nicknamed him Verissimus. It means the truest, or the most genuine. High praise from an emperor who made a career of spotting authenticity. And then there was the omen. During one of the Salii ceremonies, something happened. The sacred helmet, the one Marcus was wearing, came loose and fell. It tumbled through the air and landed on the head of the statue of Mars that stood nearby. The priests went very quiet. The crowd went very quiet, because that kind of thing, the sacred object of the young initiate landing on the war god's own effigy, that wasn't an accident. That was a message. That was the universe making a point, whether Marcus believed in omens or not. And as a Stoic, he had complicated feelings about that sort of thing. The people around him certainly did. The story would follow him for the rest of his life. It would be told at his funeral. It would be told by his biographers. People would say, the gods marked him young. They always knew. What they couldn't have known, what Marcus couldn't have known not yet, was that the marking would come at a cost. And then a tutor arrived who would change everything. Quintus Junius Rusticus, a Stoic philosopher, already well regarded in Rome, a man who would go on to become prefect of the city. Rusticus gave Marcus a copy of the Discourses of Epictetus. Now, if you don't know Epictetus, stay with me, because his story is almost as extraordinary as Marcus's. He was a former slave, a Greek slave owned by a Roman master who had been lame from birth, or made lame by his master. The accounts differ, and the difference matters, but that's a story for another night. He had gone on to become one of the most celebrated philosophers in the Roman world, and his central teaching was beautifully, devastatingly simple. Some things are in your control, some things are not. Marcus read the discourses. Then he read them again. Then he read them a third time, and by then they had become something less like a book and more like a mirror, showing him what he already sensed, but had not yet had the language to articulate. He was 15. He had found his philosophy. What he didn't know was that philosophy was about to demand everything it had to offer. Because the year he turned 17, Emperor Hadrian summoned his grandfather. There was, Hadrian explained, a problem. The empire needed to be passed on. He had chosen a successor, a man named Antonines, well-regarded, capable, exactly the right sort of man for the position. But Hadrian had a condition. Antonines would adopt 2 boys as his heirs. One of them was Marcus. The grandfather came home and told his grandson the news. Marcus Aurelius, at 17 years old, learned that he would be emperor of Rome. He wept, not tears of joy, not the tears of a boy overwhelmed with gratitude at being singled out, elevated, given everything a Roman aristocrat was supposed to want. Not that. Tears of dread. He wept by his own account because he understood, even then at 17, with all the philosophical grounding in the world, exactly what he was walking into. He did not want to be Caesar. He wanted to be a philosopher. He was about to spend the next 23 years discovering that sometimes life gives you the exam before the lesson is finished. Philosophy is easy when life is comfortable. Marcus was about to discover what happens when the theory meets the fire. Most apprenticeships last a few years. Marcus Aurelius served his apprenticeship for 23 years. Antoninus Pius, his adoptive father, his emperor, the man he would study with the intensity of a doctoral dissertation, was, by the standards of Rome, remarkable. What made him remarkable wasn't conquest or spectacle, or the grand architectural projects that tend to make emperors memorable. What made Antoninus remarkable was his temperament. He governed with a gentleness that was almost unprecedented at that level of power. He was patient, he listened, he held court himself, in person for hours at a time, because he believed that the people who came to the emperor with problems deserved to be heard by the emperor himself. He was also, and this is the part Marcus paid closest attention to, deeply unimpressed with the trappings of power. Antoninus lived modestly by imperial standards. He didn't need the spectacle. He didn't need the performance. He governed because governing needed to be done, and someone had to do it well. And he happened to be the someone. Marcus watched all of this. Marcus filed it all away. He was not idle during these years. He was deeply engaged in the work of preparing. He was absent from Antoninus's side exactly twice in 23 years. Twice. Think about that. 23 years, and he left twice. He did not tour the provinces. He did not seek military glory. He did not try to build his own court, or his own faction, or his own reputation, separate from his emperors. He stayed. He waited. He learned. Waste no more time arguing about what a good man should be, he would later write. Be one. For 23 years, he was practicing that. Now, I want to tell you something about Antoninus that I think is deeply beautiful. something Marcus recorded in his own words years later as one of his most important lessons. On one occasion, Antoninus said something that Marcus never forgot. He said that neither philosophy nor empire takes away natural feeling, that a good man is allowed to feel. That feeling is not weakness, that the Stoic project is not to become a stone. It's to feel what you feel and choose what you do with it. Marcus was going to need that lesson, more than he knew. He was learning from the best. But the teacher was about to leave, and the exam was about to begin. In February of 161 AD, Antoninus Pius fell ill. He was 74 years old, which was remarkable for the era, and he had lived well and governed well, and by most accounts felt that he had done what he came to do. He transferred the golden statue of the goddess Fortuna, the one that sat in the emperor's private chambers, the one that was said to carry the fortune of Rome, to Marcus. And then Antoninus Pius went to sleep and did not wake up. Marcus Aurelius, age 40, was Emperor of Rome. He did not want to walk through the door alone. This is one of the first things Marcus did in the very first days of his reign that set him apart from every emperor who had come before him. He refused to be emperor by himself. He had a co-heir, a man named Lucius Verus, who had been adopted alongside him by Antoninus at Hadrian's insistence, and Marcus immediately elevated him to co-emperor. Full emperor. Equal rank. This had never been done before in Roman history. Not like this. Not with genuine equal power shared between two living men. The Senate was baffled. The people were surprised. Lucius Verus himself was probably a little stunned. Marcus was 40 years old, freshly crowned, and already rewriting the rules. He did not have long to enjoy the novelty. Within weeks of his accession, word arrived from the east. The Parthian Empire, which occupied roughly the territory of modern Iran and Iraq, had been restive for years. They had been watching Rome's imperial transition, gauging the strength of the new administration, looking for the moment when Rome's attention would waver. And they had found it. Almost as soon as Antoninus was in the ground, the Parthian king launched an invasion of Armenia, a client kingdom that Rome considered under its protection, and then pushed further into the Roman provinces themselves. It was the kind of geopolitical crisis that could define or destroy an emperor's first year. Marcus made a decision. He sent Lucius Verus east to manage it. Now, there's a note of practicality here that I want to be transparent about. Lucius Verus was, by most accounts, a capable military figure, but not an exceptional one. He was also somewhat less interested in the daily labor of governance than Marcus was. He liked spectacle. He liked comfort. He was handsome and gregarious and charming in ways that Marcus was not. And the eastern provinces had a different culture than Rome. A culture that responded well to display and ceremony. And Lucius Verus could provide those things. Marcus's best generals went with him. Avidius Cassius, most notably, a brilliant, aggressive military commander who would go on to win the Parthian War, and who would also, years later, become one of Marcus's most complex problems. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. Lucius went east. Marcus stayed in Rome. And the thing about staying in Rome in 161 AD was that Rome needed you there. The empire's domestic administration was staggering in its complexity. The provinces, the finances, the courts, the food supply, the infrastructure, the endless stream of petitions and disputes and legal questions that required the emperor's attention. Marcus threw himself into it. He held court for hours. He sat on the judicial bench himself, hearing cases, because he believed that justice was not something you could fully delegate. That somewhere in the act of listening to a dispute, of looking at the faces of the people who'd brought it to you, there was moral information that no written summary could capture. He worked through the night, often. And in the quiet hours when the official business was done and the household had gone to sleep, he wrote. Those notes, those private pages, the ones he called in Greek to himself, the ones we call the Meditations. You have power over your mind, not outside events, he wrote. Realize this and you will find strength. He was working something out. He had been working it out for years, and the weight of the crown had not lightened the labor. If anything, it had made the philosophical project more urgent. Because now the stakes were real. Now the philosophy wasn't practice. Now it was survival. The soldiers won the war, and they brought something back with them. Something far worse than any army. It came from the East. We know now that the disease we call the Antonine plague almost certainly originated somewhere in Central or East Asia. The best historical estimates put its origin in China, spreading westward along the trade routes that connected the ancient world in ways people didn't fully understand and couldn't map. It traveled with soldiers, with merchants, with the invisible traffic of a world that was more connected than it appeared. The Roman soldiers who'd been fighting in Parthia, the ones who had won the war, who were marching home triumphant, they were carrying it. They didn't know. How could they know? They felt fine. Or some of them felt fine. Or some of them had already recovered and were now immune and were carrying it silently, the way you carry a letter without opening it. The legions came home. The disease came with them. It arrived in Rome, or at least became impossible to ignore in Rome, around 165 to 166 AD. And once it arrived, it did not leave. The physician Galen was in Rome when it hit. Galen, who is the closest thing the ancient world had to a systematic medical scientist, who had written more about human physiology than anyone alive, who had built his career on careful observation and precise documentation. Even Galen was rattled by what he saw. He described it with the clinical precision that was his habit, but you can feel the horror underneath the Latin. Fever, diarrhea, vomiting, skin eruptions, red papules that turned black, sometimes pustular, sometimes dry and flaking, a blackness around the throat, a breath so foul that those who came to care for the sick could often smell the disease before they could see the patient. And death, in many cases, not gentle, not quick, but a grinding deterioration over days or weeks. In Rome alone, at the height of the outbreak, Galen recorded somewhere between 2,000 and 5,000 deaths per day. Per day. Picture your city. Picture it emptying. Not all at once. Not in the dramatic, apocalyptic fashion of a battle, where the catastrophe is visible and the grief has a shape. But steadily. One neighbour, then another. A street that was full of voices last week and today is half silent. Bread sellers who are gone from the market. Priests who stop appearing at the temples. The child who played in the courtyard. And then didn't. The streets of Rome began to fill with bodies that no one was coming to collect. The army was devastated. This is the part that terrified Rome as a political entity, not just as a collection of human lives. The legions, the trained professional soldiers who were the spine of the empire's power, were being killed by the plague at catastrophic rates. You can train a soldier in a year. You cannot replace the experience of a veteran who has served for 15 years. And those veterans were dying. The financial system staggered. Trade routes collapsed. The provinces that supplied Rome's food supply were struggling. The tax base was shrinking because the people who paid taxes were dying. Everything that the Pax Romana, the great Roman peace, that 200-year project of stability and prosperity that Marcus had inherited and sworn to protect, everything it had built was being undermined simultaneously. And here is where the Stoic philosophy stopped being an intellectual exercise and became something necessary. Marcus knew, he had always known, Epictetus had told him, his grandfather had modelled it, Rusticus had articulated it, that the great trap of powerful men in crisis was the illusion of control. The belief that if you were emperor, you could stop things, that your will was sufficient, that the gap between intention and outcome was a problem of effort, and if you just tried harder, gave more, worked longer, the catastrophe would bend to your authority. Rome had seen emperors break against that belief, had seen them turn cruel or paranoid or desperate, grasping for control they couldn't achieve, and punishing the people around them for the failure. Marcus knew this trap. He had written about it. He had written that a man who rails against the unchangeable is wasting the energy he needs for the changeable. That grief and rage at what cannot be altered are forms of self-destruction, dressed up as righteousness. The plague could not be willed away. He couldn't argue with it. He couldn't arrest it. He couldn't make an example of it to discourage future plagues. What he could do, he would do, and what he did was extraordinary. Every other leader in Rome fled. The wealthy fled to their country estates. The officials fled to provinces where the plague hadn't reached yet. Even Galen, the great Galen, the most famous physician alive, eventually left Rome, citing a divine call from Asclepius, the god of medicine, which was the ancient world's way of saying, I need to not be here anymore. Marcus did the opposite, and he stayed. He stayed in Rome, at the center of the dying, and he worked every day, every night. He held court. He issued edicts. He managed the crisis with the same methodical attention he brought to every other administrative problem, because the alternative was despair. And despair was the one thing he absolutely could not afford to model. The plague tested Marcus's soul, but what came next would test his body. It began with an inventory. Marcus walked through the imperial treasury, the great storerooms of the Palatine Hill, where the wealth of Rome was concentrated in the form of gold, silver, art, furniture, and the kind of decorative objects that only exist because someone has more money than they know what to do with. And he made a list. Not a general list, a specific list. An accounting of every golden goblet, every silver plate, every decorated vessel, every piece of artwork, every jewel, every piece of fine furniture that the imperial household possessed and did not need. And then he sold them. Not quietly, not through intermediaries, not with the kind of administrative discretion that might have allowed Rome's other powerful families to pretend it wasn't happening. He held an auction. In the open air, in a public location lasting for 2 months. The citizens of Rome, and anyone else who could afford to bid, came to buy the emperor's possessions. Golden wine cups that had been Hadrian's, furniture that had been in the imperial apartments for generations, works of art that wealthy collectors had been coveting for decades, and Faustina's jewelry. Faustina was his wife, Marcus Annius Faustina, called the Younger, and she was not a simple woman to love. She was the daughter of Antoninus Pius, which meant Marcus had married his adoptive sister, which was a common enough arrangement in Roman aristocratic circles. She was intelligent and socially adept, and had given Marcus 13 children, 9 of whom he would bury. The marriage was complicated by the accounts of the time. There were rumors about Faustina that Marcus's enemies loved to circulate. Marcus never addressed the rumors publicly. What he did, privately in his meditations, was write about gratitude for her, about the ways she had supported him, about the children she had given him. And when the empire needed money for the plague response, he put her jewelry in the auction. Not his military equipment, not the administrative infrastructure of the empire, her jewelry. I want you to understand what this meant symbolically in a culture where the display of wealth was inseparable from the display of power. An emperor who showed up at state occasions with his wife in lesser jewelry was an emperor who was communicating something to his aristocracy, to his senate, to his enemies at the edges of the empire. He was saying, I have given what I had to give. I am spending myself on this. The auction raised enough to fund a comprehensive plague response. Marcus cancelled debts. This was significant, not just symbolically, but practically. In a time of economic crisis, debt is a multiplier of suffering, turning every subsequent problem into a catastrophe, because people have no reserves, no margin. By cancelling certain categories of debt, Marcus gave ordinary Romans room to breathe, room to survive. He organized and paid for funerals. At the height of the plague, bodies were accumulating in Roman streets because families couldn't afford burial, or because entire families had died together and there was no one left to arrange the ceremony. Marcus committed imperial resources to burial of the poor. This was extraordinary on multiple levels, practically because unburied bodies were a disease vector, spiritually because Romans believed deeply in the obligation to the dead, and humanly because it said to the living that the emperor saw them. He hired Galen, or, more precisely, he negotiated Galen's return to Rome after the physician had departed for his home in Asia Minor. Galen's medical knowledge, while limited by modern standards, was the best available. Marcus paid for the best. And through all of it, through the organizing, the administering, the attending to the infinite practical details of a plague response being managed by a man who had never expected to be managing a plague response, Marcus kept his public composure. Mostly. There was one moment. One moment that people who were there remembered afterward. That got written down. That came to us through the historical record with the specificity of something true. The kind of detail that survives because it was too human to forget. At some point during the worst of the plague, someone in Marcus's presence said something about the people who were dying, some kind of dismissal, the way people sometimes deal with overwhelming grief by reaching for cold comfort, by finding a frame that makes the loss feel less like loss. The person said, and the exact wording varies between sources, but the sense of it is consistent, that the people dying of the plague were blessed, that they were being spared the longer miseries of life, that perhaps the dying were the fortunate ones. Marcus wept. In public, in front of advisors and staff and whoever else was present. He wept openly, in a culture and a position where weeping was understood as weakness, where the emperor was supposed to be above ordinary grief, where the whole project of Stoic philosophy could be, and was by some critics, caricatured as an ideology of emotional suppression. He wept anyway, because he had read enough Epictetus to know that the Stoic project was not to become a stone, and because he had heard Antonines say all those years ago that neither philosophy nor empire takes away natural feeling. He wept because these were people, not statistics, not population figures in a ledger, not the abstract citizens that administrative language tends to produce. People, with families who loved them, with mornings they were going to have that they were not going to have now. He wept. And then he went back to work. I want to pause here for a moment. Just a moment. Because Marcus just taught us something, and I don't want us to rush past it in the dark. He stood in the middle of the worst crisis of his reign, a plague that was killing thousands every day, that was dismantling the empire he had spent his life preparing to govern. And he asked himself a simple question. Not, why is this happening to me? Not, how do I make it stop? But, what is mine to do? What is within my reach? What can I actually, genuinely move? The dying, he could not stop that. The fear, he could not legislate it away. The grief, he could not outrun it, and he was honest enough not to try. But the auction? That was his to do. The debt cancellation? His. The funerals? His. The presence in Rome? The refusal to flee? The daily showing up? His. The Stoics called this the dichotomy of control. Some things are in your power. Some things are not. And the entire practice, the daily practice, the 3 a.m. practice, the sitting in the dark with your thoughts practice, is learning to feel the difference in your hands, learning to put down the things you cannot hold and pick up the things you actually can. I don't know what you're carrying tonight. I don't know what brought you here, what worry walked you into this small hour, what future is knocking at the back of your mind. But I want to offer you what Marcus found in that tent, on that frozen Danube, in those pages he never meant for anyone to read. You don't have to solve everything tonight. You just have to find the thing that is yours to do. And if you'd like to sit with these lessons a little longer, I've left something for you in the description below. A free ebook of tonight's story, so you can return to these moments whenever you need them. And a set of fireside notes, a companion guide to help you reflect on what we've talked about tonight. The things Marcus learned. The things that might, if you let them, become yours. They're there when you're ready. No hurry. Now, back to Rome. Because Marcus had solved the plague, not ended it, the plague would burn for another 15 years, but managed it. Held the line. Kept the empire together through sheer, grinding, principled persistence. He had auctioned his household and organized the funerals, and stayed when everyone else fled, and wept when weeping was what the moment required. But the plague had done something else. Something that Marcus, in the middle of managing the crisis, hadn't fully seen coming. The army was devastated. The trained legions that Rome depended on for border defense were a fraction of what they needed to be. The empire's frontiers, thousands of miles of them, were now being held by understrength forces that had been further weakened by disease. And the Germanic tribes on the other side of those frontiers had noticed. Marcus needed soldiers. He needed them urgently. And he needed to find them from a pool of available men that was dramatically reduced by 5 years of plague. So he did something that made Roman senators groan audibly. He recruited gladiators. Yes, those gladiators. The ones from the arenas. The crowd pleasers, the theatrical combatants, the men whose job was to look terrifying while fighting in ways that were governed by elaborate rules designed to produce spectacle without necessarily producing death. He also recruited criminals and slaves, and, in a move that truly horrified the Roman establishment, he recruited Germanic tribesmen, brought into the empire as allies to fight for the empire they had been fighting against. The Roman establishment absolutely hated this. It felt like the empire lowering itself, like the machine of Roman civilization admitting it needed parts from outside itself to keep running. Marcus shrugged. He needed soldiers. These were soldiers. The philosophy was clear. You work with what is in front of you. The plague tested Marcus's soul, but what came next would test his body, because the Germanic tribes were already moving, and they were not sending gladiators. They were sending armies. There's a sound that empires make when they're about to break. It's not dramatic. It doesn't announce itself with trumpets or trembling ground. It's quieter than that. It's the sound of silence where there used to be confidence. The absence of the thing you'd always taken for granted. The moment when everyone in the room looks at each other and realizes nobody actually knows what happens next. Rome made that sound in the winter of 166 AD. The plague had done its worst. Entire legions had been hollowed out by fever. Villages along the frontier were emptied, not by invasion, but by disease, by fear, by the slow grinding exodus of people who decided that anywhere else was safer than here. The grain routes were disrupted. The treasury was strained. And Marcus Aurelius, the man who'd spent his life in libraries and courts and philosophical correspondence, was sitting in the palace dealing with the accumulated wreckage of a catastrophe nobody had planned for. He was managing it. He was always managing it. That was what Marcus did. He managed. He wrote his notes. He held his composure. He kept the machinery of empire grinding forward through sheer force of philosophical will. But managing a crisis is different from preventing the next one. And the next one had been watching. Out beyond the Danube River, that great brown ribbon that marked the edge of the Roman world, the Germanic tribes had eyes. They had scouts. They had traders who traveled into Roman territory and came back with reports. And what those scouts and traders were reporting from 165 AD onward was extraordinary. Rome was sick. Not metaphorically sick. Actually, physically, catastrophically sick. The legions that normally patrolled the Danube frontier, those disciplined, armoured, terrifying forces that had kept the Germanic tribes at bay for generations, were dying in their camps. Supply lines were broken. Fortifications were undermanned. The machine that had seemed eternal and invincible was revealed to be made of flesh and blood and breath, just like everything else. And the Germanic chieftains looked at each other across the campfires and thought, now. The man who organized what came next was named Balamar, king of the Marcomanni, a Germanic people who'd been pressing against the Danube frontier for decades, probing for weakness, occasionally raiding, always watching. Balamar was not a simple raider. He was a coalition builder, a diplomat, a man with ambition that extended beyond cattle raids and border skirmishes. He reached out to the neighboring tribes. The Quadi, pressing from the northeast. The Sarmatians, the Iazyges, the Vandals, the Buri, a constellation of peoples who'd never coordinated before, who spoke different languages and worshipped different gods, and had as many grievances with each other as with Rome. Balamar brought them together. He made them a promise. He showed them the numbers. The Romans were weak. The frontier was open. And on the other side of that frontier was everything. In 167 AD, the coalition moved. The scale of it was staggering. Sources speak of hundreds of thousands of warriors. And even if that number is exaggerated, as ancient numbers often are, the reality was enough to overwhelm the depleted Roman defences. The Danube, that supposedly permanent barrier, proved to be nothing of the kind. Germanic forces crossed it in multiple places, simultaneously, with a coordination that Roman commanders hadn't anticipated. And then they kept going. This is the part that needs to land for a moment, because it's easy to reduce the Marcomannic Wars to a military footnote, an interesting chapter in Roman history, and miss just how terrifying this was. The Germanic tribes didn't just cross the border. They didn't set up a camp and send diplomatic envoys and demand concessions. They pushed south. And south. And then further south still. The city of Carnuntum, a major Roman military base on the Danube, the kind of installation that was supposed to be impregnable, fell to the Germanic advance. 20,000 Roman soldiers were defeated there. 20,000. That wasn't a skirmish. That was a catastrophe. That was the kind of number that silences rooms, that makes generals pale, that travels to Rome on the fastest horse available, and arrives in the palace like a physical blow, and still the tribes came south. They crossed into what is now Austria. They pushed through mountain passes that Roman engineers had built roads through, that Roman legions had marched along for generations, assuming they were moving through their own territory. They reached the Po Valley in northern Italy, the heartland, the core, the place where Roman civilization had its roots, where the old families had their estates, where people had spent their entire lives assuming that the war, the actual war, the existential clash between civilization and the outer darkness, was happening somewhere else, on someone else's frontier, far away from here. The last time Germanic or Gaulish forces had penetrated this deep into Italy was during the Second Punic War. That was over 300 years earlier. That was Hannibal, the name Romans still used to frighten children. the city of Aquileia was besieged, or Tergium was destroyed. Smaller settlements disappeared entirely. Not conquered, not occupied, but simply erased from the map. And in Rome, 400 miles away, the panic was palpable. People who'd never thought about the borders, never considered what lay beyond the empire's edges, were suddenly confronted with a very simple and very frightening question. What if Rome isn't permanent? What if this whole thing, the Senate, the aqueducts, the libraries, the legal codes, the roads that went everywhere, the architecture that seemed to be made of forever, what if all of it was just contingent? What if it could simply end? Marcus heard about the invasion while still dealing with the aftermath of the plague. Think about what that moment must have felt like. He'd just spent years managing an unprecedented medical catastrophe. He'd sold palace treasures to fund the response. He'd held the empire together by sheer will and administrative competence. And now, before the bodies were even fully buried, before the census had recovered its numbers, before the legions had been rebuilt to anything approaching strength, now came this. The Stoic philosophy he'd spent decades studying had a lot to say about adversity, about accepting what you cannot control, about finding the rational response to chaos. Marcus had written, was writing, because he wrote constantly, almost compulsively, notes to himself about these principles. Don't disturb yourself by picturing your life as a whole. Deal with what's in front of you. Respond with reason, not with fear. Easier said, perhaps, than done. When what's in front of you is a multi-tribal coalition that has just broken through your best defensive line and is currently burning its way through northern Italy. But here's the thing about Marcus Aurelius that sets him apart from almost every other emperor Rome ever produced. He didn't panic. He didn't flee to the south. He didn't delegate the problem to someone else and hope for the best. He didn't appoint a general and wish him luck and go back to his books. He went himself, the philosopher who preferred books to swords, strapped on armor, and marched toward the sound of war. This requires a moment of appreciation, because it wasn't inevitable. Emperors didn't always lead from the front. Many of them, probably most of them, managed wars from a comfortable distance, sending orders through intermediaries, reading dispatches by lamplight, staying safely behind the walls of Rome while other men did the dying. That was acceptable. That was often smart. The emperor was too valuable to risk. Marcus went anyway. He organized a recruitment drive that went beyond anything Rome had done in generations, freeing slaves to serve, hiring Germanic mercenaries. The irony was not lost on anyone. Conscripting gladiators who'd been trained to fight for entertainment and were now being redirected towards something rather more serious. He rebuilt the legions. He restocked the treasury through land sales and austerity measures. He planned. And then he led. For the next 12 years, the libraries would be replaced by tents. That's not a metaphor. That's a literal fact about the life of Marcus Aurelius. The man who'd grown up surrounded by tutors, who'd been educated by the finest philosophical minds in the Mediterranean world, who'd written more personal philosophical reflections than almost any other Roman emperor. That man would spend most of the remaining years of his life in military camps along the Danube frontier, sleeping on a camp bed, breathing the cold morning air of the northern wilderness, waking to the sound of sentries and trumpets instead of birdsong and fountain water. He was 50 years old when the wars began, not a young man by the standards of the ancient world, not someone who'd spent his youth training for combat. His health was already fragile. It would get worse out here. But he went anyway, and he stayed, and he fought, because that was what was required. And Marcus Aurelius, for all his philosophical equanimity, for all his meditations on acceptance and impermanence, and the smallness of human concerns, was relentlessly, ferociously committed to doing what was required. There's a line at the beginning of Book 2 of the Meditations, those private notes Marcus kept for himself, the ones he never intended anyone else to read. That says, simply written at Carnuntum. 3 words, that's all. But those 3 words place us somewhere specific. They put us in a military camp on the Danube frontier, in the middle of a war, in the cold. They tell us something remarkable, that in the midst of commanding multiple legions against a multi-tribal coalition that had already shattered one Roman army, Marcus Aurelius was writing philosophical reflections. Not battle plans, not dispatches, not administrative orders. Though he wrote those too, constantly, because the empire doesn't stop needing to be governed just because you're at war. Philosophy, personal, private, almost tender. You have power over your mind, not outside events. Realize this, and you will find strength. He wrote that in a military camp. Think about that. Think about what was visible from the tent flap. The Danube in the distance, brown and cold, the permanent grey of the northern sky, sentries walking their posts in the pre-dawn dark, the distant smell of cook fires, the permanent low-grade tension of a frontier camp that knows the enemy is out there somewhere. And inside, by candlelight, a middle-aged philosopher emperor was writing notes to himself about equanimity. The Danube frontier was not Rome. This needs to be understood as a physical reality, not just a geographical fact. Rome was warm marble and fountain water and the accumulated refinements of centuries. The Danube frontier was mud and cold, and the particular bleakness of the northern European wilderness, the forests that seemed to go on forever, the rivers that flooded without warning, the weather that cycled through cold and colder, and occasionally, briefly, something approaching bearable. Marcus had been raised in comfort, not extravagance. He was famously unextravagant, even as emperor, but comfort. The kind of comfort that comes from having always been surrounded by people who considered your well-being their primary concern. Tutors, servants, the accumulated care of the imperial household. Out here, he had a tent. He wrote about the cold, not directly. The Meditations aren't a diary. They don't describe external events. But you can feel it in the writing. The repeated emphasis on endurance, on doing what must be done regardless of how one feels about it, on the distinction between what is painful and what is bad, because those are not the same thing, and the failure to distinguish between them is one of the great sources of human suffering. Do not disturb yourself by picturing your life as a whole. He wrote that for himself, as a reminder, because Marcus Aurelius, for all his philosophical achievements, was human, and humans, even extraordinarily disciplined, deeply philosophical ones, sometimes lie awake in the cold and picture their life as a whole. And what the whole picture looked like, from a military camp on the Danube in 170 AD, was not encouraging. The empire he'd inherited at 40 had seemed stable, manageable, full of possibility. 18 years later, it had been ravaged by plague, was being attacked on multiple frontiers simultaneously, and he was personally responsible for preventing its collapse. He had a son, Commodus, 12 years old, who would one day inherit this. He had a wife, Faustina, who had borne him 13 children and was somehow still travelling with him on campaign, which was itself both remarkable and deeply telling about the nature of their partnership. He had been emperor for almost 2 decades. He would probably die emperor, and the bulk of whatever years remained to him would be spent here, in camps, along rivers, far from everything he'd actually wanted from life. Do not disturb yourself by picturing your life as a whole. Deal with each thing as it comes, and ask yourself only, is there something in me that can handle this? There always was. That was the answer, every time. Maybe not comfortably, maybe not without cost, but always, yes. There is something in me that can handle this. The military campaigns of the Marcomannic Wars were complex, strategically, logistically, diplomatically. Marcus wasn't just fighting, he was managing a frontier that stretched hundreds of miles, coordinating multiple legions, dealing with supply chains that crossed mountains and rivers, negotiating with allied tribes, making decisions about which enemy leaders to engage, which to pardon, which to eliminate. He was good at it. This is the part that surprises people. The image of Marcus Aurelius that history has given us, the gentle philosopher, the reluctant ruler, the man who'd rather be reading, sometimes obscures the fact that he was genuinely, competently effective as a military commander. Not in the tactical genius sense that history assigns to figures like Caesar or Alexander, but in the deeper, harder sense. He could sustain a campaign. He could hold an organization together under pressure. He could make the thousands of unglamorous decisions that determine whether an army remains functional over months and years. He was also, quietly, keeping the empire running while doing it. Dispatches travelled between the Danube frontier and Rome constantly. Court cases that required imperial judgment, administrative decisions, appointments to positions. The endless bureaucratic machinery of governing a Mediterranean empire continued to demand his attention even as he was simultaneously directing military operations against people who would very much like to kill him. He wrote, in the Meditations, "Confine yourself to the present." He was trying. He genuinely was. But the present kept expanding. The present kept including more. More decisions, more crises, more people depending on him, more weight. The present was a very crowded place for Marcus Aurelius. What's almost unbearably poignant, if you think about it too long, is the private nature of the Meditations themselves. These weren't written for publication. They weren't political philosophy or imperial propaganda. They were a man talking to himself, reminding himself of things he believed, working through the gap between what he knew intellectually, the Stoic framework, the philosophical certainties, and what he felt, which was everything human beings feel when they're cold and tired and carrying too much. The impediment to action advances action. What stands in the way becomes the way. He wrote that, maybe on a night when the supply wagons were late and the weather was terrible, and a courier had just arrived with news from another section of the frontier that required immediate attention. Maybe on a night when he was simply exhausted, in ways that philosophy alone couldn't fix. The camp at Carnuntum was his home for stretches of years. Not weeks, not months, years. The other officers would have rotated, would have had periods of leave, would have returned to Rome and to comfort, and to the ordinary human life of wives and children and meals that didn't come from campaign kitchens. Marcus stayed. He was the emperor. He couldn't leave until it was done. And it was not for a very long time done. The first years of the campaign were about stopping the advance, pushing the Germanic forces back from Italy, securing Carnuntum and the Danube line, rebuilding the defensive infrastructure that the plague years had allowed to deteriorate. This was grueling, grinding, unsexy military work. Not great battles with decisive outcomes. Attrition. Logistics. The slow, painful reassertion of Roman control over territory that had been lost or threatened. Marcus commanded in person. He ate what the soldiers ate, slept where the soldiers slept. Roughly, he was still the emperor. There were limits. Walked the fortifications in the early morning, talked to officers and centurions about what was working and what wasn't. He was present in a way that mattered, not performing presence, but actually being there. And at night, by candlelight, he wrote, "Waste no more time arguing what a good man should be. Be one." He'd been away from Rome for 8 years. 8 years. His son Commodus was growing up in dispatches. A child becoming a young man through letters and reports. A relationship mediated almost entirely by correspondence. His friends were in Rome. His library was in Rome. Everything he'd built his inner life around was in Rome. But the frontier was where the work was. And Marcus Aurelius was going to do the work. Marcus was writing his way through the darkness. But the darkness was about to get personal. Summer, 173 AD. The campaign had been going for 6 years. The Roman 12th Legion, the Fulminata, the Thunderbolt Legion, one of the most decorated units in the Roman military, had pushed north of the Danube into the territory of the Quadi. This was aggressive campaigning, taking the fight into enemy territory, rather than simply defending the Roman side of the river. Marcus had decided that defense alone wasn't going to end this war. He needed to project power. He needed the Germanic tribes to understand that Rome could reach them wherever they were. It was working. Mostly. Except for the part where the Quadi, a Germanic people who knew this territory intimately and had been fighting in it their entire lives, managed to encircle a significant Roman force in a mountain valley and cut off their water supply. This was, to use the technical military terminology, a very bad situation. The Roman soldiers were surrounded. The summer heat, and it was hot, genuinely savagely hot in a way that the men had not expected this far north, was depleting them faster than the fighting. Water was life. Everyone knew it. And the water was gone. The Quadi controlled the rivers. They'd blocked access to every stream in the valley. The Romans were trapped in a bowl of summer heat, with no shade worth mentioning, no relief, and an enemy that was content to simply wait. Wait and watch, while Roman soldiers ran through their water rations and then began to die from thirst, one by one, in the summer sun. It was a clever strategy. Brutal but clever. Why fight Romans in close combat when you could simply wait for the sun to kill them? The Roman soldiers prayed. What else do you do in a situation like that? The philosophers among them might have reflected on the Stoic teachings about accepting what you cannot control. The more practically minded among them might have been calculating how long a human body can survive without water. Not long in summer heat while wearing armor. Most of them probably just prayed. To whoever was listening. To Jupiter, to Mithras, to whatever local gods might be persuaded to intervene, to the Egyptian deities that had spread across the empire with the merchant trade, to the Christian god that some of the soldiers, a small minority but present, believed in. And then the sky opened. It started with clouds. Dark, fast-moving, the kind that builds suddenly in mountain valleys and mean business. The soldiers saw them coming and understood, with the desperate hope of men who have been told for 3 days that no help is coming, that something was about to change. The rain fell, not a drizzle, not the half-hearted spitting that passes for rain in many places. A deluge. The kind of rain that turns flat ground into rivers, that overwhelms the capacity of even prepared minds to process. The soldiers, parched, exhausted, many of them already showing the early signs of heat stroke, turned their faces up to it and drank. They held up their shields and caught water in the hollows. They opened their mouths and let the sky pour itself into them. They were saved. But the miracle, if that's what it was, wasn't finished. While the Romans drank and recovered, while the thunder that had been part of the storm system rolled through the mountains, that thunder turned into something else. The storm descended on the Quadi positions. Lightning struck, not once, multiple times, with a precision that the surviving accounts describe as deliberate, targeted, intentional. The Quadi's siege equipment was struck. Their formations were disrupted. The soldiers who had been calmly waiting for Romans to die of thirst were suddenly dealing with a thunderstorm that seemed to have identified them personally. The Roman soldiers, revitalized, are now fighting with the additional psychological advantage of believing their gods had just visibly intervened on their behalf, pushed through the Quadi lines. The battle that should have been a Roman defeat became a Roman victory. Now here's where it gets interesting, and this is one of those moments where history is more honest than it might have been, because multiple explanations survived for what had actually happened, and none of them fully agree. The first explanation came from the historian Cassius Dio. The miracle was caused by an Egyptian magician named Arnuphis, who was traveling with Marcus's army and who had somehow conjured the storm through ritual magic involving the god Hermes. The second explanation came from Julius Capitolinus, who wrote a biography of Marcus. The emperor himself had prayed, and his prayers had been answered, making this a testimony to Marcus's personal relationship with the divine. The third explanation came from Eusebius, the early Christian historian. The miracle had been worked by the prayers of the Christian soldiers in the 12th Legion, who had called upon their God and been answered. This was early Christians doing what early Christians often did, noting every possible piece of evidence that their God was real and powerful and paying attention. The fourth explanation was Marcus's own, which was characteristically vague. He acknowledged that something remarkable had happened. He attributed it in general terms to divine providence. He was not specific about which deity or which prayers or which practitioner had been responsible. 4 explanations, 1 miracle. And Marcus never took credit for any of it. That detail says something about him. He was the emperor. The narrative of divine favor falling on Rome through the emperor was available to him, was in fact almost expected. Roman emperors regularly presented themselves as conduits for divine approval. He could have said, "I prayed, the gods answered. This is what my virtue looks like when the heavens respond to it." That story would have been politically useful, morale-boosting, entirely consonant with how Roman emperors presented themselves. He didn't. He distributed the credit, or perhaps more accurately, he simply declined to claim it for himself. The rain fell. The soldiers survived. The Quadi were defeated. Whatever caused those things to happen, it was beyond his knowing, and he wasn't going to pretend otherwise. The event was immortalized. The column of Marcus Aurelius, that carved marble cylinder that still stands in Rome, that tells the story of the Marcomannic Wars in a spiral of carved images, depicts the rain miracle as its opening scene. Jupiter Pluvius, the rain-bringer, presides over the scene with outstretched arms. Below him, Roman soldiers drink. Below them, Germanic enemies are struck by lightning. It is one of the most dramatic images on the column, possibly the most famous. But notice what's not in the image. Marcus isn't in it, at least not in the central role. The god is the agent. The soldiers are the beneficiaries. The emperor, somewhere off to the side, is the context. He commissioned that column. He chose that composition. He chose, in the permanent record carved in marble, to center the divine act and the soldiers, not himself. The 12th Legion, after the rain miracle, received a new name in some accounts: the Thunderbolt Legion. Whether this was because of the miracle or because of the name they already had is one of those historical questions that probably can't be resolved. But the story stuck. The rain that saved them stuck. The lightning that struck the Quadi stuck. Sometimes the universe does seem to respond to prayer, or to need, or to something. Marcus Aurelius, the Stoic, the rationalist, the man who believed in a world governed by logos, by divine reason that permeated all things, might have said that the distinction between miracle and providence was less important than people assumed. The universe was rational. The rational universe sometimes provided what was needed. Whether you called that magic or prayer, or luck or the rain cycle of mountain valleys was, in the end, a matter of perspective. The soldiers of the 12th Legion didn't much care about the philosophy. They were alive. They were drinking. The enemy was retreating. That was enough. 8 years is a long time. 8 years is long enough for a child to grow from infancy to grade school, long enough for fashions to change, for political landscapes to shift, for the people you left behind to reorganize their lives around your absence in ways that are quietly shocking when you finally come back. Long enough that when you return, you realize you've become a kind of ghost, present in the world's memory, present in official capacity, but absent from the actual texture of daily life in a way that leaves marks. The citizens of Rome had watched Marcus Aurelius march away to the Danube frontier in 168 AD. They had watched him stay away for year after year, managing the war through dispatches, returning briefly for administrative necessities, always going back. The children who'd watched him leave were teenagers now. The old men who'd cheered him through the streets had died. The city had kept going as cities do, organizing itself around the idea of an emperor who was technically present but practically, tangibly, perpetually away. They had a way of expressing this, a small gesture that had spread through the city, the kind of organic cultural response that nobody organized but everyone understood. When Marcus Aurelius came up in conversation, which was often because he was the emperor, and people do talk about their rulers, Romans would hold up 4 fingers on each hand. 8 years, 4 fingers, twice. There's something both touching and melancholy about that. A whole city counting the years on their fingers. Not angry about it exactly. Marcus was popular, was genuinely beloved, was not the kind of emperor people complained about quietly over their wine. Just noting it, marking the time, keeping the tally that everyone was keeping. He was coming back, because the war, finally, was turning. The shift had been gradual. These things always are. No single decisive battle, no dramatic moment when the Germanic coalition shattered and the legions advanced in triumph. It was more like the slow reversal of a tide. The Germanic forces, which had been flowing south with apparently unstoppable momentum in 167 and 168, began to meet resistance. They began to meet Roman forces that were rebuilt, resupplied, commanded directly by the emperor himself. They began to realize that what had looked like the permanent weakness of Rome was actually a temporary condition, that the machine was repairing itself, that the plague years were giving way to a renewed imperial strength, that was, if anything, more motivated than before. By 170 AD, the Germanic advance had been halted. By 172 and 173, Roman forces were beginning to push back, reclaiming the territory lost, rebuilding the fortifications along the Danube, pushing north across the river into territory that Rome had never formally controlled, but now needed to make safe. Marcus crossed the Danube personally. This was not a small thing. The Danube was the edge of the Roman world, the boundary between civilization, as Rome defined it, and the outer darkness where the rules were different. Crossing it with an army was a statement. It said, "Your territory is not safe from us." It said, "We don't just defend, we advance." It said, "The empire that you thought was broken is standing at your door." The Quadi, after years of fighting, began to negotiate. Their king, a man named Ariogassus, had been captured, taken in one of the Roman operations north of the river, brought in chains to the Roman camp. He was a king. He had commanded armies. He had been for years a genuine threat to Roman security. Marcus pardoned him. Not just pardoned and exiled him to Alexandria. The great city of Egypt, one of the most sophisticated and cosmopolitan places in the ancient world. Warm and wealthy, and full of Greek philosophy and Egyptian mystery, and everything that was furthest from the cold Danube frontier. Ariogassus, captured Germanic king, was sent to Alexandria to live out his days in comfortable obscurity among people who had absolutely no idea what to make of him. It was almost funny if you thought about it, almost a kindness laced with a joke. Your punishment for threatening Rome is that you have to live in Alexandria. But it was also strategic, and it was also humane, and it was also entirely consistent with how Marcus Aurelius approached these things. What did it accomplish to kill Ariogasus? He was defeated. He was captured. His people were in the process of making peace. Killing him would make a point. Rome does not forgive its enemies. But it would also make a martyr, would give the remaining Quadi a reason to keep fighting, would close off the diplomatic channels that Marcus was using to end the war without destroying the relationship permanently. Pardon him. Send him somewhere he can't cause trouble. Keep the door open for peace. Peace came. Slowly, imperfectly, with the particular ambiguity that characterizes the ends of long wars. Nobody signs a clear treaty on a single definitive day. Everyone retreats to their side of the river and catches their breath and tries to assess what was actually accomplished. But it came. The Germanic coalition fractured, as coalitions do when the immediate pressure eases. The Marcomanni, the Quadi, the other tribes that had joined Balamar's Great Alliance, discovered that there was less holding them together than there'd seemed, and drifted back toward their own concerns. December 23rd, 176 AD. The Triumph. Roman triumphs were ceremonial events. Formal recognition of a military victory, the kind of spectacle that Rome excelled at, that combined genuine celebration with carefully orchestrated ritual. The general or emperor who'd won the victory rode through the streets in a chariot. The captured enemies walked in chains before him. The legions marched behind. The crowd cheered. Marcus Aurelius rode through Rome on December 23rd, and the city came out. 8 years. 8 years of absence, of counting on fingers, of watching dispatches arrive and wondering when, if, their emperor would come home. And now here he was, older, weathered, visibly marked by a decade of frontier living, but here, real, present, not a name on a dispatch, but a face in the streets. The 4 fingers went up across the crowd. A kind of greeting, a kind of acknowledgement. We counted. We waited. You came back. 8 years, the longest business trip in Roman history. He had aged. The portraits of Marcus from early in his reign show a relatively young man. Bearded, yes, in the philosopher style he'd adopted. But vital, with something still soft in the face, the lingering youth of a man who'd spent his 20s in libraries. The portraits from this period, after the wars, show someone different. The lines are deeper. The eyes have a quality that's hard to describe in stone, but recognizable in any face that has seen too much. Not harshness, not bitterness, but a settled knowledge of what the world actually contains. He was 55 years old. He had been emperor for 25 years. He had been at war for more than half of that time. And now, finally, he was home. His son Commodus was 15 or thereabouts, and had been co-opted as co-emperor. Marcus, aware of his own fragility, had done this to ensure the succession was clear. Commodus would need to be prepared. The empire would need to continue. There were things Marcus still needed to do, decisions still to be made, the grinding administrative work of governing a civilization that didn't stop just because you'd been fighting a war. But for a moment, just a moment, standing in the chariot as it moved through the streets of Rome, surrounded by the sound of a city that had waited 8 years for him to come home, Marcus Aurelius could rest. Except he couldn't, because while he was fighting barbarians, someone was planning to take his throne. There's a particular kind of betrayal that's worse than the betrayal of an enemy. Enemies are supposed to betray you. It's in the description. When an enemy does something terrible, you might be hurt by it. You might suffer consequences from it. But you're not surprised by it in the deep, disorienting way that matters. When a friend betrays you, the ground moves. Avidius Cassius had been Marcus Aurelius's most trusted general for years. His story begins in Syria. He was Syrian by birth, Greek by education, Roman by career, which was itself a kind of testament to what Rome was at its best, a civilization that could absorb people from anywhere and make them fully, authentically Roman. Cassius had worked his way up through the military hierarchy, had distinguished himself in the Parthian War, had been given command of the eastern provinces, 7 full legions, an enormous amount of military power. He was also, by all accounts, a genuinely capable and genuinely difficult man. Effective, hard. The kind of commander who maintained discipline through something that was maybe one step removed from terror. There are accounts of him executing soldiers for minor infractions with a severity that other commanders thought excessive. His men feared him. They also, by the logic that sometimes applies to very demanding leaders, followed him without hesitation. Marcus trusted him, really trusted him, not just tolerated him, not just found him useful, but actually believed him to be a man of good character operating from genuine loyalty. He'd given Cassius enormous responsibilities. He'd relied on him to manage the eastern part of the empire, while he himself was occupied on the Danube. There was, as far as Marcus was concerned, a genuine partnership here. This matters for understanding what happened next. Because what happened next wasn't the betrayal of a political rival who'd been quietly plotting all along, or at least, that's not how Marcus understood it. 175 AD. The war was ending, but not quite ended. Marcus was on campaign, had been on campaign, was dealing with the accumulated military and diplomatic complexity of wrapping up a multi-year frontier conflict, and his health was not good. It had never been good. Marcus Aurelius had been a sickly child, had been a sickly young man, and had spent years in the cold and damp of the Danube frontier doing absolutely nothing to improve the situation. There were periods of genuine illness, weeks where the dispatches coming from the imperial camp described an emperor who was functioning but barely. A rumor started. The specific origin is lost. These things always are. The first whisper is gone before anyone thinks to record it. But the rumor that spread through the eastern provinces in 175 AD was, Marcus is dead. Not critically ill, not weakening, dead. What does a loyal general do when he hears that his emperor is dead? When the succession is unclear. When the empire could fracture. When the eastern provinces, his eastern provinces, the ones he'd been governing and defending, might be claimed by any number of competitors, each with an army, each with ambitions. What Avidius Cassius did was declare himself emperor. There's a version of this story in which he was manipulated. There's a persistent account, ancient and not fully verifiable, the kind of story that might be true, or might be the kind of story that grows up around a complicated event to make it legible. That Faustina herself had written to Cassius. That she'd told him Marcus was dying or dead. That she'd asked him to declare himself emperor in order to protect her and her children from whatever power vacuum might follow. Whether or not that account is true, and historians have been arguing about it for a very long time, the result was the same. In 175 AD, with the Marcomannic Wars still technically ongoing, the Roman Empire suddenly had two emperors. The legitimate one, alive and absolutely furious on the Danube frontier, and a usurper in the east with 7 legions behind him. The eastern provinces, hearing the announcement, mostly went along with it. Not out of passionate loyalty to Cassius, he wasn't that kind of beloved, but out of the practical calculation that 7 legions is a lot of legions, and the emperor who's right here is more compelling in certain ways than the emperor who's far away. Egypt went over to Cassius. Syria went over to Cassius. Parts of Asia Minor went over to Cassius. Marcus received the news in the way that men receive very bad news when they've spent decades training themselves to receive bad news with equanimity. He processed it, he breathed, he responded from reason rather than from rage. And what he said, what he is recorded as having said, the words that his contemporaries thought worth preserving specifically because they were so remarkable, was this: I would yield the empire to him if they consider him to be better suited to rule. Let that breathe for a second. A usurper has just declared himself emperor. 7 legions have gone over to him. Multiple major eastern provinces are flying someone else's flag. The man's own subjects are, in some measure, saying, actually, we prefer the other guy, and the legitimate emperor, the man who has earned everything, who has spent 12 years on the Danube frontier in defense of this empire, whose sacrifices for Rome are written on his face and in his body. That man's response is, well, if they think he's better, maybe they're right. Some would say Marcus was naive. Others might call it the bravest response in Roman history. There's something going on in that statement that's worth examining. Marcus wasn't actually going to yield the empire. He knew perfectly well that wasn't how it worked, that simply standing aside wouldn't prevent a civil war, that the machinery of empire didn't have an actually you can have it setting. He was expressing something deeper. He was expressing a genuinely stoic conviction that the empire wasn't his property, wasn't something he had a right to in the cosmic sense, wasn't worth blood and chaos to preserve. If Cassius was genuinely better for Rome, if the empire would function better under his rule, then what right did Marcus have to resist? His job was to serve Rome, not to keep the title for himself. Of course, there was also the practical reality. He needed to address the rebellion. He mobilized. He began moving legions east. He sent orders. And this is another of those moments that says something essential about Marcus Aurelius. He sent orders that Cassius was to be captured, not killed, not executed, not cut down by some enterprising officer who figured That's what the emperor probably wanted. Captured, brought to him, because Marcus wanted to talk to him. He wanted to understand. He wanted to ask Cassius directly. Why? Was the rumor of my death enough? Were you really protecting the empire, or were you just ambitious? What happened to the man I trusted? The empire was preparing for civil war, and Marcus Aurelius was primarily interested in having a conversation. He also did something else, something that speaks to the administrator in him, to the man who understood that wars have political dimensions that outlast the fighting itself. He drafted a letter to the Senate. In it, he asked the Senate to be merciful toward anyone who'd supported Cassius, to refrain from executing the leaders of the eastern provinces who'd switched allegiances, to understand that people caught between two emperors make difficult choices, and that those difficult choices shouldn't be punished with death once the matter was resolved. He was preparing to win and simultaneously preparing to forgive. The army mobilized. The legions that had been fighting Germanic tribes on the Danube now pivoted east toward the Syrian frontier. Marcus himself prepared to lead them, because of course he did. Because of course he went himself, because that was who he was. And then, 3 months after the rebellion began, before Marcus had even reached the east, before there was a battle, before there was a confrontation, before the conversation Marcus wanted to have, a centurion killed Cassius. Not under orders, not through any official process, just a centurion who had decided that killing the usurper was probably what the emperor wanted, and who had the access and the opportunity, and didn't spend too long thinking about whether it was actually the right thing to do. Cassius was dead. The rebellion was over, and Marcus Aurelius, who had mobilized an army to capture, not kill, who had been preparing to forgive, who had wanted to have a conversation, received the head of his former friend, and said, by all accounts, that he wished it had been otherwise. He had wanted to forgive his friend, but fate had other plans. There's a Stoic teaching about the things that are not in our control, about accepting that the universe will do what the universe does, that the best intentions and the most careful plans will sometimes be undone by a centurion with a sword and a limited understanding of the complexity of the situation. Marcus had wanted to look Cassius in the eye, had wanted to understand, had wanted to extend the kind of grace that he'd been extending his whole life, to the Germanic kings, to the soldiers who failed him, to the endless parade of people who fell short of what they could have been. He didn't get to. The universe, that rational, providential universe he'd spent a lifetime trying to understand, had made other arrangements. He ordered the letters that implicated other people in the conspiracy to be burned unread. He didn't want to know. He didn't want to have evidence that would require him to act against people he'd rather forgive. He explicitly, deliberately chose not to know things that would make mercy harder. That's not naivety. That's a man who has thought very carefully about what kind of person he wants to be, and is making active choices to protect that in himself. The column of Marcus Aurelius, standing in Rome, tells the story of the Marcomannic Wars, the triumphs, the battles, the rain miracle. It doesn't tell the story of Avidius Cassius. because that story was too complicated, too human, too ambiguous for a column of carved victory scenes. But Marcus carried it. He carried it in the Meditations, in the way he wrote about betrayal and loss, and the impossibility of controlling other people's choices. He carried it in the space where a question had been. What happened to the man I trusted, and now never would be answered? He had been emperor for almost 30 years. He had fought plagues and wars and conspiracies. He had buried friends and children, had spent a decade in military camps, had written philosophy by candlelight in the cold. And somewhere in all of that, in the accumulated weight of everything Rome had asked of him and everything he'd given, he was still writing, still thinking, still asking himself every morning, what does reason require today? You have power over your mind, not outside events. Realize this, and you will find strength. He'd written that for himself, as a reminder. He still believed it, after everything. The plague, the wars, the rain in the mountains, the friend who wasn't, the execution he'd never wanted. He still believed it. That's what the darkness couldn't take from him. Not the title, not the health, not the years he'd wanted to spend reading instead of fighting. But this, the conviction that somewhere inside the chaos and the loss and the accumulated weight of a life spent in service to something larger than himself, there was a still point. A place where reason lived, a place that was his. And from that place, he kept going. 3 months and 6 days. That's how long the rebellion lasted. That's how long Avidius Cassius, general, war hero, would-be emperor, managed to hold the eastern provinces before his own men turned on him. History doesn't linger on the exact timing often enough, I think, because 3 months and 6 days is both a long time, and not long at all. Long enough to tear an empire apart at the seams. Not long enough, apparently, to convince a Roman centurion that his commander's ambitions were worth dying for. The soldier's name has been lost to history. We don't know what he was thinking when he did it. We don't know if he was loyal to Marcus, or frightened for his own future, or simply tired of the whole affair. What we do know is that one morning, somewhere in the east, in the blazing summer heat, he drew a sword and ended it. And then, because this was the Roman Empire, and such things were expected, he put the head of Avidius Cassius in a sack and began the long journey back to the emperor. Marcus was in Antioch when the news arrived. And this is where the story does something remarkable. This is where it tilts, quietly, away from every story we expect. Because when you or I imagine a Roman emperor receiving the head of his greatest enemy, we imagine relief, we imagine vindication, we imagine perhaps a grim satisfaction, a necessary ugliness in the name of justice. What we do not imagine is what Marcus actually did. He wept. He turned the soldier away. He refused to look at the head. He reportedly said, and I want you to sit with this for a moment, that he wished Cassius had lived, that he wanted the chance to show him mercy, that the chance to demonstrate forgiveness, to stand before a man who tried to steal his throne and say, I will not kill you. That chance was now gone. and its loss grieved him, as though he had suffered a defeat, not won a victory. That is not what we expect from emperors. That is not, if we are honest, what we expect from anyone with that kind of power. Power, in our experience, tends to sharpen the appetite for punishment. The higher you climb, the more satisfying it becomes to watch those who opposed you fall. The Emperor of Rome, the most powerful human being alive, had just watched his most dangerous adversary die, and his reaction was to grieve the missed opportunity for mercy. There's something almost disorienting about that. I've sat with it many times. Publius Marcius Verus, the man who had commanded in the East, who had defected from Cassius back to Marcus, who understood exactly how many people had been compromised by this rebellion. He understood what needed to happen next. He gathered all of Cassius's correspondences, every letter, every record, every name of every senator, general, or official who had hedged their bets and written to the rebel pretending to offer support. There were apparently quite a few. He burned them all. Not after making copies, not after creating a list for future reference, not to preserve some strategic leverage for a later date. He burned them completely so that Marcus could stand before his Senate and his empire and say honestly that he did not know who among them had conspired against him. Because if Marcus didn't know, then there could be no trials, no purges, no settling of accounts that had, in every previous generation, resulted in rivers of senatorial blood. History had given Marcus the perfect excuse to eliminate his rivals. He reached for it, looked at it carefully, and set it down. What he did instead was address the Senate. He asked, and the word asked is doing real work here, because he was the emperor and technically he didn't have to ask anything. He asked them to ensure no bloodshed. He wanted no executions, no property confiscations, no exile. He told them that nothing had happened that could not be forgiven, and that he intended to prove it. Cassius's son, pardoned. Cassius's daughter, pardoned. Her husband, pardoned. The officers who had followed Cassius, pardoned. The eastern cities that had declared for him not punished. The soldiers who had taken up arms against Marcus, reintegrated. All of it, just forgiven. You can read the histories and find scholars who raise an eyebrow at this. Some have argued it was strategically clever, that clemency builds loyalty more efficiently than punishment. And that's true. It is strategically clever. But I don't think that's the whole story. I think Marcus understood something more fundamental than strategy. I think he understood that the desire for revenge is a kind of trap, that the moment you let punishment become personal, the moment you start confusing justice with satisfaction, you've already lost something important about yourself. The man who had power to destroy his enemies chose to protect them. And he did it not because destroying them would have been wrong politically. He did it because destroying them would have been wrong, full stop. I want to pause here, just briefly, and speak to you directly for a moment. Because I'm wondering if you're holding something tonight. Not necessarily something dramatic. You don't have to have survived a rebellion to carry a grudge. Sometimes it's smaller than that. A friend who betrayed a confidence. A family member who chose a side during a difficult moment. Someone who made you feel small in a room full of people and has never apologized and probably never will. Here's what I'd gently recommend you try. Just as an experiment, tonight before you drift off, bring that person to mind. Not the worst person in your life. Not the wound that's still raw and bleeding. Just someone you're holding a grudge against. Someone you're still carrying, because carrying them has become a habit. And ask yourself the question Marcus asked himself over and over in the Meditations. Does holding this anger protect me, or does it imprison me? The answer, I suspect, you already know. Forgiveness isn't about them. It was never about them. It's about whether you're willing to set down a weight that was never yours to carry in the first place. That's all. Just sit with it. That's the whole question. Marcus had survived plague. He had survived wars that stretched across decades. He had survived betrayal from the man he had trusted most with the Eastern armies. He was still standing, still leading, still writing in his journal at night, still asking hard questions of himself. But one adversary had been there all along, waiting. Not out in the provinces, not across the Danube River, not in the ambitions of rival generals. This adversary lived inside his own house. If you want to understand the full weight of Marcus Aurelius's life, you have to understand his children. Not Commodus. We'll get to Commodus soon enough, and that will require its own kind of preparation. I mean his children, all of them. The full terrible arithmetic of fatherhood under the Roman Empire, where infant mortality was not an abstraction but a constant companion, a guest that arrived uninvited and never fully left. Marcus and Faustina had 14 children together. 14. 2 of those were sets of twins. 14 lives brought into the world by a couple who, by all accounts, genuinely loved each other. A rarity in dynastic marriages, and worth noticing. 14 children who were named, baptized, presented to the Roman world, who existed and breathed and cried and smiled. At least 8 of them died before Marcus did. Sit with that number for a moment. I mean really let it land. 8 children, more than half. And these weren't all infants, though some were. Some of them lived long enough to have names that meant something, long enough that losing them tore a hole in the fabric of ordinary days. Titus Aurelius Fulvus Antoninus, one of the twins, born 161 A.D. He died at roughly age 4. His twin, Lucius Aurelius Commodus, lived. 2 little boys born the same day, and one of them gone before he could fully form his first memories. Hadrianus, Marcus's eldest son, who died at age 7. 7 years old. Old enough to have a personality. Old enough to have preferences and jokes and particular ways of asking questions. Old enough that his absence would have been loud in the household, felt in the empty places at the table, in the tutor who suddenly had 1 fewer student. Domitia Faustina, born 150 A.D., one of the earliest children, who died young. Annia Aurelia Galeria Lucilla. She survived into adulthood, so she was one of the fortunate ones. But then Annia Galeria Aurelia Faustina, another daughter, also young, and another and another. There were daughters whose names appear briefly in the historical record and then simply stop. No death announcement, no date, just a name that arrives and then, quietly, is not mentioned again, and you learn to read that silence. Marcus wrote to his rhetorical teacher and oldest intellectual friend, Fronto, about the difficulty of grief. He said, and this is striking, that he needed to contain his sadness, not eliminate it, not transcend it through philosophy, contain it, as though grief were something dangerous that could spill out and damage everything around it if he didn't hold it carefully. I find that one of the most human things anyone has ever written, because the Stoic thing would be to say he overcame the grief. The heroic thing would be to say it strengthened him. But Marcus said he was trying to contain it. He was managing it, the way you manage something powerful that isn't going away. Can you picture him? I can. Some mornings more easily than others. He's in his private chambers. This is somewhere between campaigns, somewhere in that particular Roman interior world of columns and cool stone and lamplight. And there's a silence in the room that used to contain noise. A child who would have been running through here, asking him questions, pulling at his robes. And Marcus sits with the Meditations open. He picks up the pen. And he doesn't write about the child directly. Almost never writes about the children by name, because the Meditations isn't that kind of diary. But he writes, "Loss is nothing else but change, and change is nature's delight." And then he stares at the page. And I genuinely wonder, whether he believed it in that moment, or whether he was writing it precisely because he needed to believe it and hadn't quite gotten there yet. Because that's what the Meditations often feels like. Not a record of wisdom achieved, a record of wisdom being wrestled into being, sometimes against considerable resistance. He lost a second set of twins, not in childhood this time, but earlier. The historical record is blurry on the timing, which is its own kind of heartbreak, because it means these children left so little mark that the dates are disputed. They were there, and they were gone, and the world barely noticed. The weight of it accumulates slowly as you study his life. That's the thing. It doesn't hit all at once. It builds, name by name, date by date, until you realize that the man writing, "You have power over your mind, not outside events," had stood at the graveside of his children more times than most of us will stand at any grave in our lives. He was writing from inside a loss that would have broken most people. He was writing anyway. There's a particular passage in the Meditations. I've always found it almost unbearably moving in context, where Marcus writes about how everything we hold dear is impermanent. He describes looking at kings from history who seemed invincible and are now dust. He writes about the way all things pass, and you can read that as cold philosophical detachment. You can. It's a valid reading. Or you can read it as a man who had buried enough of his children to understand impermanence, not as an abstract concept, but as a lived experience. A man who had watched the face he loved become a face in a grave, and who was still, somehow, improbably, trying to find the right relationship with the fact of loss. That's the harder reading. I think it's the true one. The grief never left him. He contained it. He wrote around it, through it, alongside it. He kept moving, kept governing, kept writing. But it was there, in the weight of the Meditations, in the way he circles back to the same themes again and again. Impermanence, acceptance, the nature of time, with the persistence of someone who has not finished being surprised by the fact that things end. At some point, and we can't know exactly when this understanding settled in him, Marcus must have realized that the losses were not going to stop, that this was simply his life. The Roman world was not gentle with children, and the most powerful man in it was not exempt from that reality. If anything, the dynastic pressure made it more acute. Sons were the point. Sons were the system. Sons were how you preserved everything you'd built. And his sons kept dying. He had one surviving son, one heir. One child who grew up to adulthood in the shadow of all those brothers who didn't make it. And then, in the winter of 175 AD, he lost the person who had been beside him through all of it. Her name was Faustina, Annia Galeria Faustina Minor. Faustina the younger, to distinguish her from her mother, and she had been Marcus's wife for 30 years. Think about what 30 years means. They were married when Marcus was in his mid-20s, when the empire and all its weight was still something he could look at from a slight remove, not yet fully his. She was there when Antoninus Pius died, and the burden landed. She was there through the plague years, when Rome smelled of death, and Marcus couldn't be certain which of his advisers would still be alive the following month. She was there at the births of the children they would lose. She was there at the burials. 30 years. He had never governed without her. He had never gone to sleep without knowing she was somewhere in the same palace. She was woven into the texture of his ordinary days so completely that her presence had probably stopped being remarkable, the way the floor beneath your feet stops being remarkable until it isn't there. She died in the Taurus Mountains, a place called Halala, in the province of Cappadocia, in the east. They were on tour together. Marcus had been surveying the eastern provinces after the Cassius affair, trying to reassure cities and stabilize loyalties, and Faustina had come with him. She died suddenly, in winter, on the road. The ancient sources are not particularly informative about the cause. Some suggest it was gout. Some suggest stress. The Taurus Mountains in winter are cold and remote, and the roads were punishing in a way we cannot fully imagine from the comfort of our modern world. She was in her mid-40s, which was not old even by Roman standards, and she had been through enough physical difficulty, 14 pregnancies, years of travel, that the body eventually presents its bill. Now, I have to address something here, because the ancient sources addressed it, and if I don't, history will just keep saying it in the background, like a rumor at a party. Ancient historians, most of them writing well after the fact, most of them with political axes to grind, made claims about Faustina's fidelity. Suggested that she had lovers. Suggested in some versions that she was somehow involved in the Cassius rebellion, that she had encouraged Cassius, perhaps because she feared for her future if Marcus died first. These stories got attached to her name and have never fully let go. Marcus, her husband, the man who was actually there for 30 years, didn't believe any of it. Or, if he did, he chose something better than belief. He wrote about her in his private Meditations, the journal not intended for any audience, with unmistakable warmth. He described her as obedient, affectionate, and simple. That word simple is interesting. Not a compliment in modern ears, but in Marcus's context it means uncomplicated, genuine, without the layers of performance and political maneuvering that surrounded everyone at court. She was, to him, the real thing in a world full of surfaces. And then there is the detail that I find most moving. The most revealing single line in all of the ancient testimony about their marriage. Someone reported, and this has the ring of something too specific to be invented, that Marcus said he would rather live on a criminal island with Faustina than in the imperial palace without her. A criminal island, the Roman equivalent of exile, the worst disgrace. He would take the worst Rome could inflict on him willingly if she was there. That's not a political statement. That's not strategic. That's a man telling you, without ambiguity, what mattered to him. Not the throne, not the empire, not the philosophical legacy. Her. His response to her death was the response of a man who understood that what he had lost could not be replaced or philosophized away. He declared her a goddess. The Roman Empire had mechanisms for this. The process of consecratio, the official deification of those deemed worthy. Marcus used every one of them. He had temples built in her honor. He renamed the town of Halala, where she died, renamed an entire city, Faustinopolis, so that the place of her death would carry her name forever. And then, this is the part that cuts through all the official formality and lands somewhere real. He established the Puellae Faustinianae, in English, the Girls of Faustina, a charitable foundation funded by the imperial treasury to provide for orphaned girls across the empire. Education, housing, dowries when the time came, a whole system designed to give the most vulnerable young women in Rome a fighting chance. He named it after her. He built it in her name, and you can read that as political display. And perhaps there is some of that in it, but you can also read it as a man who knew his wife well enough to know what she would have wanted. A man who, in his grief, tried to create something lasting that carried her values forward. Opinion gap. History has called this excessive. Some historians have suggested Marcus was naive about Faustina, that his grief made him overlook faults he should have addressed, that the deification was a kind of willful blindness dressed up as love. I've read those arguments carefully. I'm not sure history is right about that one. I think there's a kind of wisdom in choosing loyalty over suspicion when you cannot know the truth. I think Marcus, who spent his life trying to see people clearly and charitably, made a deliberate choice about how he would carry his wife's memory. And I think the Puellae Faustinianae, those girls across the empire who got an education and a chance because of him, I think they are a better legacy than whatever satisfaction the gossips were after. She was gone. The woman who had been beside him through plague and war and the death of children and the weight of the most demanding job in the ancient world. Gone. In the cold of the Taurus Mountains on the road. Marcus had lost his adoptive father, Antoninus Pius, the man who had shaped everything he became. He had lost Fronto, the friend who taught him rhetoric and whom he loved. He had lost his co-emperor, Lucius Verus. He had lost his best general, Avidius Cassius, to ambition and tragedy. He had lost 8 children at minimum. And now he had lost the person who had simply been home to him. The constant. He was alone, completely, structurally, thoroughly alone at the top of the most powerful institution on earth. No one to talk to in the way you talk to someone who has watched you become who you are. But Marcus Aurelius was not done, not even close. There was one person left. His name was Lucius Aurelius Commodus Antoninus, and he had been born on the 31st of August in the year 161 AD. The same year Marcus became emperor. The same year the plague started to whisper at the edges of the empire. The same year everything became at once both more and less manageable. Commodus was Marcus's surviving son, the one who made it. Out of all those children, through all those losses, Commodus was the one the fates left standing. And there is an irony in that, a dark, almost theatrical irony, that history can't quite resist pointing out. Because if the universe had been designing a test for Marcus Aurelius, a final examination of everything he believed about reason and wisdom and legacy and love, it is hard to imagine a more precise instrument of torment than Commodus. Understand what Marcus was. Understand the complete picture before I tell you about the sun. Marcus Aurelius was, whatever his failures and whatever his flaws, a man who had spent his entire conscious life in the disciplined pursuit of understanding. He woke early. He read. He wrote. He sought out teachers and loved them, not for status but for what they could show him. He was bookish in the way that people who love books are bookish, not as performance, not as display, but because the inside of a question genuinely interested him more than most other things on offer. He governed an empire, commanded armies, survived plague and war and betrayal. And through all of it, he wrote in Greek, in a private journal, about the nature of the good life. He couldn't turn it off. It was simply who he was. Commodus was not interested in books. This is worth saying plainly, without euphemism. Ancient sources and modern historians have used various careful phrasings, physical rather than intellectual, more attracted to spectacle than philosophy. And all of those are accurate, but they tend to soften what was, from Marcus's perspective, probably a fairly obvious reality. His son inherited none of his work ethic, inherited none of the patient, grinding, joyless but somehow necessary quality of running the world with attention. Commodus was drawn to physical things, to wrestling and athletics and the arena. He had a physical confidence, a charisma of the body, that had nothing to do with wisdom. He was also, by most accounts, charming in the way that certain young men are charming when they haven't yet encountered real consequences, bright-eyed, physically impressive, good at the surface of things. The problems were beneath the surface, and Marcus, who spent his career looking beneath surfaces, could see them. Think about the childhood for a moment. Commodus was born in 161 AD. And by 162 his father was managing plague and beginning what would become the Marcomannic Wars. The Germanic campaigns began in earnest around 168, and essentially didn't end until Marcus died. That's roughly 17 years of intermittent warfare on the Danube frontier, 17 years during which Marcus was, more often than not, in a military tent somewhere in the north. Commodus grew up with a father who sent letters. There is no way to say that isn't a tragedy, for both of them. Marcus was not absent because he didn't care. He was absent because the empire required his presence on the frontier, or the empire would fall. He sent careful letters. He arranged the finest tutors. He tried, from a distance, to shape a son he barely knew. But there is simply no substitute for being in the room, for the daily texture of a father's presence, the way it calibrates what a child understands about work and patience, and the long, unglamorous effort of becoming. Commodus was raised effectively by servants, and by the imperial machinery, and by the particular kind of deference that everyone shows to someone they know will one day be emperor, which is the worst possible environment for building character, if you think about it. It's a hothouse that produces exactly the wrong qualities. Entitlement comes easily. The patience required by true learning doesn't arrive on its own. Marcus named Commodus Caesar at age 5. 5. Too young to understand what it meant, but old enough for everyone around him to start treating him accordingly. His twin brother, Commodus, had a twin, another set of twins in this family marked by twins, died during a medical procedure. The ancient sources suggest it was some kind of operation, possibly to remove a tumor, that went wrong, so Commodus grew up also shaped by that, by the knowledge that his brother had been there, and was now not. Another absence in a childhood full of absences. When the time came to think about succession, Marcus looked at his options. This is the decision that historians have, for 2,000 years, argued about with barely diminishing intensity. He could have looked among his generals, his adopted sons-in-law, the broader circle of the Antonine dynasty. There were capable men available. Tiberius Claudius Pompeianus, Marcus's son-in-law, who had married his daughter Lucilla, and who was, by most accounts, a genuinely capable administrator and soldier, was offered the throne. Not informally either. Marcus apparently put it to him directly, and Pompeianus said no. He cited his age, his origins. He was Syrian, not from the traditional Roman aristocracy, and his own sense that he wasn't the right man. He said no 3 times, 3 separate occasions on which Marcus essentially said, "The empire is yours if you want it," and Pompeianus looked at the thing and declined. 3 times. I think about that often. What does it say about the job? About what Pompeianus had watched Marcus go through? The accumulated cost of it? That a capable man looked at the offer and said no, repeatedly, even when the emperor was asking. That left Commodus. The only surviving son, raised at court, named Caesar at 5, given every advantage and shaped by none of them into quite the right form. Marcus elevated him to co-emperor in 177 AD, when Commodus was 16 years old. 16. The same age Marcus had been when Hadrian first noticed him, when the whole long education had begun. But Hadrian's notice had sent Marcus toward books and philosophy. Power at 16 did something different for Commodus. Marcus must have known. That is the thing that haunts this part of the story. He wasn't naive. He wasn't incapable of seeing clearly. We have the Meditations to prove he saw clearly in every other department of his life. He must have understood that Commodus was not equipped for what the job required. He wrote, with characteristic understatement, about Commodus's simplistic nature. That word, in that context, is one of the most painful things Marcus ever wrote, because it's the word a father uses when he's trying to describe something honestly, without destroying the person he's describing. So what do you do? What do you do when the person you love most, your only remaining child, the one survivor out of all those losses, is the wrong person for the task? What do you do when the choice is between your grief and the welfare of 100 million people? When love and wisdom pull in opposite directions? Marcus chose his son. He gave Commodus the throne. Whether that was the right choice is a question that historians have not resolved, and I suspect they won't. What I can tell you is that it was a human choice. A choice that tells you something real about what Marcus was made of. That under all the philosophy and all the self-discipline and all the decades of training himself toward virtue, there was a father who loved his son and could not bring himself to deny him. Commodus would go on to be by any reckoning one of the worst emperors in Roman history. He would rename Rome after himself. He would spend public funds on gladiatorial spectacle. He would abandon the frontier negotiations Marcus had spent years building. He would, in short, undo nearly everything Marcus had carefully constructed. He would become, in the most precise possible sense, the anti-Stoic. The living refutation of everything his father had believed and written and embodied, as though the universe needed to prove that virtue can't be inherited. But that was still in the future, as Marcus approached the end of his life. In the present, there was one enemy left. Not plague, not the Germanic armies massing north of the Danube, not the ambitions of rival generals, not even the grief that had walked beside him for decades. The last enemy lived inside Marcus's own mind. There is a particular kind of night that soldiers know. The campaign is over for the day. The noise has stopped, the logistics, the orders, the 1,000 small urgent decisions that fill the daylight hours, all of it has gone quiet. And in that quiet, the mind begins its own campaign. Marcus knew those nights better than most. Picture him in his tent. Somewhere on the Danube frontier, maybe the Carnuntum camp, maybe one of the forward positions in what is now Hungary or Slovakia. The lamp is lit. Outside, the sounds of a military camp settling into sleep, the occasional murmur of sentries, the distant shuffling of horses, the wind across the plain. Inside, Marcus is alone with the one enemy he could never negotiate with, never outmaneuver, never simply order to stand down. He picks up his pen. Today I escaped from anxiety, or no, I discarded it because it was within me, in my own perceptions, not outside. He paused, read it back, wrote it again, slightly differently, on another page, on another night, weeks later, returned to it again after that. The Meditations is full of these returns, the same fears visited and revisited, the same struggles met again from new angles, as though the problems were not solved so much as held at bay, and required constant vigilance. This is the thing that the popular image of Marcus Aurelius gets subtly wrong. The image is of a serene philosopher king, a man so deeply rooted in wisdom that external events slide off him like water off stone. And yes, he was wise. Yes, he achieved things that most of us would struggle to imagine achieving. But the Meditations, the actual document read carefully, is not the record of a serene man. It is the record of an anxious one. Marcus suffered from insomnia. The ancient sources mention it, and the Meditations carries its marks. Passages written clearly in the dead of night, when the camp is quiet and the mind is loudest, when sleep has refused to come, and the only available remedy is the pen and the page. He wrote in Greek, his private language, the language of philosophy, the language in which he could think most precisely, and he wrote alone without any expectation that anyone else would ever read it. This was not performance. This was not the carefully constructed public stoicism of the emperor reviewing his troops. This was a man, alone in his tent, trying to think his way through the dark. He was afraid. Let's be direct about that. He was afraid of death. Not in the way we might imagine, not the visceral animal fear, but in the subtler philosophical way, afraid that he hadn't used his time well enough, afraid that he hadn't become who he should have become. He was afraid of losing control, of the vast, complicated machine of empire, running beyond his ability to correct it. He was afraid of his own mind, of the way thoughts could become catastrophic when left unattended, how anxiety could scale from a single worry to an entire terrifying future in the time it takes to lie awake for an hour. He was afraid of what would come after him. And here is what he did with all of that fear. He developed a set of tools. Not vague consolations, not comfortable bromides about how everything works out in the end. Actual, specific techniques for managing the mind under pressure. Techniques that modern cognitive science has independently rediscovered and repackaged as CBT, cognitive behavioral therapy, and which are now used in clinics and therapy offices around the world. 2,000 years after a Roman emperor worked them out in a military tent. The first tool he reached for, most consistently, was present moment focus. Confine yourself to the present, he wrote. He understood, in a way that anticipates modern neuroscience, that most suffering is not actually about the present moment. It's about the projected future or the remembered past. The present moment, if you actually arrive in it, is almost always manageable. It's the imagined moments, the catastrophes you're rehearsing, the losses you're anticipating, that unmoor you. Marcus returned to the present constantly. He treated it as a kind of anchor. The second tool was cognitive distancing. He had a practice, this comes through clearly in the Meditations, of describing things in the most neutral possible language. Wine, fermented grape juice, imperial purple, dye from a shellfish. The crowd applauding, a noise made by tongues. He stripped the glamour and the threat from things by describing them plainly. This sounds simple. It is, in practice, surprisingly powerful. The thing that fills you with dread, described plainly, often turns out to be considerably less than it appeared. The third tool was what he called the view from above. He imagined himself deliberately at a great height, looking down at the Roman Empire, at the Mediterranean, at the whole turning world. And from that height, the thing that had been consuming him would shrink into its actual proportion. Your anxiety about tomorrow's meeting looks different when you're imagining it from orbit. This is not dismissiveness. Marcus wasn't telling himself his problems didn't matter. He was recovering a sense of scale, placing things in their actual context. And then there was premeditatio malorum, the premeditation of evils. This one is counterintuitive enough that it's worth explaining slowly. Marcus deliberately imagined the worst outcomes. He sat with them, thought them through, allowed himself to picture the difficult thing happening. The battle lost, the child not surviving, the campaign failing. He looked directly at the feared future and thought it through to the end. And what he found, what he argued consistently across the meditations, was that imagined catastrophes are almost always more threatening than the reality. That the mind's fear of a thing is constructed partly from the refusal to look at it clearly. When you actually look, when you walk all the way through the imagined disaster to the other side, you discover you're still standing. You discover you could survive it, not that you want it to happen, but that it would not end you. He suffered insomnia and used the nights. He was anxious and used the anxiety, turned it by a kind of disciplined aikido into material for the meditations. He was afraid of death and wrote some of the most enduring meditations on mortality in human history. Every weakness, every fear, every sleepless hour became an occasion for work. Don't let your imagination be crushed by life as a whole, he wrote. Don't try to picture everything bad that could possibly happen. Stick with the situation at hand and ask, why is this so unbearable? Why can't I endure it? He was talking to himself. He was also, across 20 centuries, talking to you. Now, here, in the quiet of this narration, in the part of the night where you're drifting, I want to ask you something. And I want you to actually sit with it, not just let it wash over you. If you'd been standing where Marcus stood, emperor of the known world, the weight of 100 million lives resting on your decisions, the plague still moving through your cities, the armies requiring your attention, and behind all of that, the quiet grief of children buried, a wife gone in the mountains, a mentor's voice no longer available, a friend who tried to take your throne. If you had been inside all of that, truly inside it, feeling its full weight, would you have picked up the pen? Would you have sat down in a cold tent in the middle of the night and tried to think your way through it? Written in a private language that no one was going to read, asking hard questions you couldn't fully answer, returning to the same fears over and over, because that's how the work of the mind actually goes. I've thought about this myself. Many times, honestly, I'm not entirely sure I would have. There's something in the gesture, that private, unglamorous, persistent effort to understand, that I find almost more impressive than any of the battlefield victories or political achievements. Those required courage and intelligence, certainly. But writing in the dark, alone, when there was no audience and no reward, and no guarantee it would help, that required something else, something quieter, and I think harder. He was building himself, rebuilding himself night after night against the erosion of everything experience was doing to him. Never let the future disturb you, he wrote. You will meet it if it comes with the same weapons of reason which today arm you against the present. Let me say that one more time, because it deserves to be heard slowly. Never let the future disturb you. You will meet it if it comes with the same weapons of reason which today arm you against the present. This is not optimism. Marcus Aurelius was not an optimist in any conventional sense. He'd buried too many people for that. This is something more durable than optimism. It's a confidence not in outcomes, but in capacity. The future might be terrible. He knew that. He had watched the future arrive in the shape of plague and war and loss, and be genuinely terrible. But he had met each terrible arrival with the tools he had. And the tools had been, if not quite sufficient, then at least adequate. He had survived. He had kept going. He had not been destroyed. The weapons of reason. That's the phrase. Not luck, not divine favor, not the particular circumstances of what arrives. The weapons of reason. The things you carry inside yourself. The capacity for clear thought, for present moment attention, for cognitive distancing, for premeditation of difficulty. Those things, he was saying, will be there when the future arrives. They will be there because they are yours, and you can trust them, even if you can't trust anything else. He wrote this in a military tent. He wrote it as an emperor who had watched the plague kill 5 million people. He wrote it as a man who had buried half his children. He meant it. The Meditations is not a finished product. That is perhaps the most important thing to understand about it. It is not a collection of wisdom that arrived fully formed, polished, ready for distribution. It is rough in places. It repeats itself. It circles back. It contradicts itself, sometimes from one book to the next, the way real thinking contradicts itself when the thinker is honest enough to keep following the thread wherever it leads. It looks like what it was, a man working through his material in real time, in the dark, with no certainty that he was getting anywhere. The same fears appear again and again. The fear of death, the anxiety about whether he was living rightly, the frustration with people who behaved badly, the struggle to maintain equanimity in the face of events that made equanimity feel like a lie. He never fully resolved these. He kept returning to them, kept applying the tools, kept working. That is the practice. That's what the Meditations is showing you. Not that the anxiety disappears, not that the work reaches a completion point, but that you can engage with it night after night, with patience and without despair. That the engagement itself is the thing. That the writing is the medicine, not because it produces an answer, but because it keeps you honest, keeps you present, keeps you working. He had been, in his own quiet way, at war with his own mind for decades. The war had shaped him, had produced the Meditations, had produced the philosophical framework that 2,000 years later is still being read and used and argued about, and returned to in difficult moments by people who never expected to find comfort in a Roman general's journal. The war wasn't over. But Marcus had learned something essential about how to fight it. Outside the tent, the Danube frontier stretched north into darkness. The Germanic tribes were there, regrouping, waiting for the next season. The empire's business went on, always going on, always demanding, never fully resolved. Commodus was somewhere in the camp, young and physically confident, and in ways that must have been both a comfort and a grief to his father. And Marcus picked up the pen one more time. He had fought plague. He had fought wars on 3 frontiers for most of 2 decades. He had survived betrayal from a man he had trusted completely. He had outlasted the grief of children lost, a wife lost, mentors and friends and co-emperors lost. He had fought, night after night, the most persistent enemy of all, the one that lived inside his own skull and specialized in making the already difficult feel impossible. He had outlasted them all. He was still writing. But the final battle was still ahead, and it was coming faster than anyone knew. Here is something you need to understand about Marcus Aurelius. He asked the same question 9 times. Not 9 times over the course of his life. 9 times in the Meditations alone. The same framework, the same 2 options, the same conclusion, written out again and again across 12 books, as though repetition might finally make it stick. You could flip open the Meditations to almost any section and find some version of it waiting for you. The universe is run by divine providence, or by atoms, by cosmic design, or by pure chance, by a rational God who orders all things toward their proper end, or by an infinite swirl of matter, colliding and separating, cold and purposeless, with no one watching and nothing ever meaning anything. That was the question, and it tormented the greatest empire on Earth's greatest emperor for most of his adult life. But here's what I find extraordinary about it, because it's not what you'd expect. The answer Marcus kept arriving at every single time was not a choice between the 2 options. It was a dissolution of them. He kept writing in different words, but always to the same point. It doesn't matter. Either way, you should act virtuously. Either way, the path is the same. Whether divine reason guides history or blind atoms govern it, your response remains unchanged. Do good. Think clearly. Accept what you cannot control. Return to virtue. The nightlings who were here for our evenings with Seneca might remember something similar. That same stoic certainty that inner peace isn't found by controlling the world, but by controlling how you respond to it. Marcus took that idea and pushed it even further. Seneca wrote it elegantly. Marcus wrote it desperately. There is a difference between the 2, and it matters. Because Seneca was, in many ways, at leisure. He had time to compose himself, to arrange his thoughts, to deliver his wisdom in polished letters to polished young men. Marcus wrote the same argument 9 times in a private journal that wasn't meant for anyone else's eyes. That's not philosophy. That's therapy. That's a man sitting in a military tent at the edge of the world, by the light of a guttering lamp, telling himself the same thing over and over because he cannot yet fully believe it. Breathe, Marcus. It doesn't matter. Either way, be good. The Stoics inherited this question from the 2 great opposing schools of Greek thought. On one side stood the Stoics themselves, who believed the universe was permeated by logos, a divine rational principle that ordered all things. The cosmos was not random. It was a system with intention. Human reason was a fragment of that larger reason, a spark of the divine fire. When you acted rationally and virtuously, you were participating in the universe's own nature. You were, in some sense, cooperating with God. On the other side stood the Epicureans, who disagreed almost entirely. The Epicureans, following the older atomist philosophers, believed the universe was made of particles, atoms, moving through void according to mechanical laws. No intention, no oversight, no divine reason threading through history. Just matter doing what matter does. The world was not planned. It was assembled. And when it breaks apart, it simply assembles differently, with no memory of what it was before. Now here's where it gets philosophically interesting. The Stoics and Epicureans, despite disagreeing on the nature of everything, arrived at remarkably similar practical conclusions. The Stoics said, "The universe is rational, therefore live rationally and virtuously." The Epicureans said, "The universe is indifferent, therefore stop worrying about what you can't control and live simply and well." Different cosmologies, rhyming ethics, two paths through opposite philosophies, arriving at something almost identical. Marcus saw this. He had studied both schools, and in the Meditations he returns again and again to the logical point that if both competing worldviews lead to the same practical wisdom, then the debate itself is beside the point. You don't need to solve metaphysics to live well. You just need to live well. There is something profoundly humane in that. Because most of us are not going to resolve the question of whether the universe has purpose. Not tonight, not ever, really. The theist and the atheist have been arguing it for millennia, and the argument shows no signs of resolution. And Marcus, writing in the 2nd century with all the philosophical tradition of the ancient world at his fingertips, essentially looked at that argument and said, "I'm not going to wait for an answer. The answer doesn't change the task. You wake up in the morning. Are you going to be kind? Are you going to do your work with integrity? Are you going to treat the people around you as fellow rational beings deserving of respect? Those questions don't wait on cosmological consensus. They need to be answered now, by you, with the life you have." He came back to this 9 times because he needed to, because there were 9 nights or more when he lay awake in a military camp at the edge of civilization, and the old question came creeping back in, the darkness pressing down, the plague moving through the camp like smoke, the faces of the dead, the future of his empire, the future of everything he loved, uncertain and untethered. And in those moments the philosophical comfort he'd spent decades building sometimes trembled, sometimes felt thin. So he wrote it again. He argued himself back from the edge again. Same premise. Same 2 options. Same conclusion. Be good, Marcus. It doesn't matter. Be good. That's not weakness. That's discipline of the deepest kind. The discipline not just of the body, not just of action, but of the mind itself, turned inward, doing the work on itself over and over, with no applause and no audience. He was alone in the dark, talking himself off a ledge he wouldn't have admitted to climbing. And then, having answered the question 1 more time, he would set down his pen, and sleep, we hope, and wake to another day at the edge of the world. I want to stay here for a moment, because I think there is something in this pattern that is easy to miss. We might be tempted to see the repetition as a flaw, as evidence that Marcus never quite got there, never quite solved the problem, never achieved the stoic equanimity he was reaching for. 9 times is a lot of times to write the same answer. If he'd really believed it, wouldn't once have been enough? But I think that reading gets it backwards. The repetition is not a sign of failure. It is a sign of what actual philosophical practice looks like. Not the kind that happens in lecture halls, all clean and sequential and concluding with resolution. The kind that happens in a life. Real life doesn't let you solve a problem and file it away. Real life brings the same problems back, in slightly different clothing, season after season, and asks you to do the work again. The equanimity you felt last Tuesday doesn't automatically carry forward to Thursday. The perspective you found in the summer doesn't come with you automatically into the winter. You have to practice it, again, every time. And Marcus, perhaps the most self-aware philosopher who ever also happened to run an empire, knew this. He didn't pretend he could write the answer once and be done with it. He respected the problem enough to meet it every time it showed up. That's not failure. That is, quietly, one of the most honest and instructive things in the entire Meditations. The work is never finished, you just keep doing it. Marcus had his answer, and he was running out of time to share it. There is a technique Marcus loved. He used it so often it became almost a signature of his thinking. A move he made repeatedly in the Meditations, a habit of mind he had trained himself to perform the way a musician trains a difficult passage until it becomes reflex. He called it, or at least we call it now, the view from above. Here is how it works. You are standing in the middle of your life. The ordinary pressures are pressing. Someone is difficult. Something has gone wrong. The small mechanical anxieties of your days are buzzing around your head like gnats, and you are too close to it, too enmeshed. The forest and the trees are the same thing from where you're standing, and everything looks enormous and urgent and important. So Marcus would pull back, mentally, deliberately. He would rise above the moment and see not just his life, but all lives, not just his century, but all centuries, spread out below him like a map. And from that height, everything rearranged itself. The problems that had seemed colossal shrank. The urgencies dissolved. The things he'd been gripping tightly revealed themselves as things that could, without disaster, be released. Time, he wrote, is a river, a violent current of events. Sit with that for a moment. A river, not a straight road you walk along, not a puzzle you solve, not a problem you manage. A river, moving always, moving regardless of whether you are in it or out of it, moving regardless of whether you are paying attention, carrying everything, the great and the small, the celebrated and the forgotten, on the same current toward the same destination. He wrote of Alexander the Great and Alexander's mule driver arriving at the same place in the end. The conqueror who changed the shape of the world, and the man who led his pack animals, both gone, both dissolved into the same earth, both subject to the same river, the same end, the same forgetting. He was not being morbid about this. He was being precise. The view from above is not a counsel of despair. It is a counsel of proportion. What does it mean that Alexander and his mule driver are equal in the earth? It means that the urgency you feel about this meeting, this slight, this problem, this fear, it is real, but it is not ultimate. It will pass. Everything passes. And that passing is not the tragedy. The tragedy would be to spend the time you have making yourself miserable about things that the river will carry off regardless. He wrote, close to forgetting it all, close to being forgotten. Not someday, now, already. We are always at every moment close to forgetting and close to being forgotten. The child who played in this street is nearly forgotten. The man who gave the orders is nearly forgotten. We are all in the process of dissolution, always, and the view from above lets you see that clearly enough to make peace with it. This sounds austere. But when you sit with it, really sit with it, in the quiet of a late night when the world has gone to sleep, there is something liberating in it. Not frightening, liberating. Because if everything passes, then so does the thing that's keeping you awake right now. The fear, the grief, the grinding worry that has taken up residence in your chest. The river is already taking it. You don't have to fight the current. You just have to float. The Stoics called this subspecies eternitatis, under the aspect of eternity. Seeing your life, your troubles, your entire civilization from the perspective of the long view. Not because the small things don't matter, but because understanding their smallness is what lets you carry them without being crushed. Marcus was extraordinary at this. He could hold both things simultaneously. The emperor attending to the urgent daily business of running half the known world, and the philosopher rising above it all to see the pattern from a height where the years blur into decades and the decades into centuries. He was present and distant at the same time, engaged and detached, fully there, and somehow always a little above. The historians who study Roman imperial art find this quality in his famous equestrian statue, the great bronze figure that survived the Middle Ages, because later Christians mistook him for the Emperor Constantine. We'll come back to that survival. It's one of history's best accidents. Even in bronze, centuries old, the figure has a quality of calm. His hand extended, palm down, not pointing, not commanding, but quieting. Easy now. Be still. I can see more from here than you can from there. It is the gesture of a man who had practiced the view from above for so long that it had become part of how he held himself in the world. He was not untouched by life. He was not cold or detached in the way of someone who simply doesn't care. He cared enormously. His letters reveal it. His meditations reveal it. The grief, the worry, the love, the fear. He felt everything. But he could also rise above it. He had trained himself to rise above it. And from above, he had learned something crucial, that the river carries everything. And the wisest thing you can do is not to drown yourself trying to stop it, but to understand what it is actually carrying and what to do with the time before it takes you too. He had a particular phrase for this quality of attention: the capacity to be fully present in a moment while simultaneously seeing it clearly from above. He wrote about the idea that rational beings are made for one another, that we are not isolated atoms. There's that word again, working its way into the cosmic framework from another direction, but parts of a single rational whole, connected by the same logos, the same divine reason that runs through everything. And when you zoom out far enough to see that, when you practice the view from above long enough to feel it not just as an idea, but as something lived, you stop needing the world to behave differently. You stop requiring the universe to reorganize itself for your comfort. You can be in it fully and above it slightly, both at once, and the tension between those two states stops being a problem. It becomes the practice. There is a meditation, he writes, that I want to sit with for a moment. He describes looking at all of human history as a single moment, not across it, not through it, as a single moment. All the generations that have lived, all the great men and small men and forgotten men, all the empires that rose and fell and were replaced by other empires that rose and fell, all the philosophies argued over, and the wars fought over, and the borders drawn and redrawn and drawn again. From above, from far enough above, it collapses into a single point, a flicker, a breath. And you are in that flicker, right now. You and Marcus both, living your separate lives in separate centuries, both in the flicker, both close to forgetting, close to being forgotten. And in that shared smallness there is a strange intimacy, because the river doesn't distinguish. What Marcus felt lying awake at the edge of the empire, afraid of what was coming, you have felt something like it. The shape of the fear is different, the content is different, but the experience of lying awake and wondering whether the thing you love will survive what's coming, that doesn't require translation. He knew that. He wrote the meditations as if talking to himself, but also perhaps as if talking to the future, to whoever might one day find these pages in some camp or some archive, or some dark corner of an unusual bookshelf. Talking to you across 2,000 years, from a height where the years are nothing. Time is a river. We are in it together. Marcus could see it all from above, the beginning and the end was closer than anyone knew. March 17th, 180 AD. The military camp at Vindobona, the place we now call Vienna, is quiet in the way that military camps are never quite quiet. There are fires burning at the perimeter. There are sentries at their posts. There is the low sound of men sleeping in close quarters, breathing in the dark. And in a tent that is slightly more substantial than the others, lit by lamps that smell of oil and smoke, the Emperor of Rome is dying. He is 58 years old, which is a good age for a man of his era, but not the age he had expected. The body that once trained rigorously under the philosopher Apollonius, that had ridden horses and led campaigns and sat upright through audiences lasting most of the day, that body has been worn through. The Antonine plague has been moving through his camp for the better part of 15 years. He has watched it take soldiers, advisors, family members. He has watched it reshape the empire he was trying to hold together, the empire whose borders had crept outward under his care and were now threatening to crack. He has watched it and served it and written about it, and now it has come for him. He knew. He had probably known for some time. Marcus Aurelius was not a man who looked away from difficult truths, and the difficult truth of his own body's failing would have been legible to him before anyone else said a word. He would have sat with it, examined it, applied the view from above, made his peace. But there were things to arrange. He summoned 5 of his most trusted advisers, men he had worked with for years, men who understood what the empire needed and what it was facing. The Danube frontier was still in play. The northern tribes had not been finally subdued. The structure of Roman power that Marcus had spent his entire reign maintaining, at enormous personal cost, at the cost of his health and his sleep, and his meditations and the years he had wanted to spend in philosophy, and had instead spent in mud, that structure needed to be handed over carefully. He gave instructions, detailed, practical instructions, the way Marcus always did things. He was until the end a man who took care of the particulars. And then there was Commodus, his son, his only surviving son, the young man who had been co-emperor for 3 years already, who had been at Marcus's side on campaign, who was 19 years old and had grown up in the worst possible environment for character formation, surrounded by flatterers and power and wealth from birth, with every weakness indulged and every hard lesson cushioned by imperial privilege. Marcus had tried. He had genuinely tried. He had surrounded his son with good tutors, good advisers, men of philosophy and principle. He had hoped, in the way parents hope against evidence, that the environment would do less damage than it appeared to be doing. But the evidence was not encouraging, and Marcus, lying in his tent at Vindobona in his final hours, knew it. He had Commodus sent away from his bedside, not because he didn't love him, but because the plague was in the room, and Marcus had one son left, and whatever Commodus was or wasn't going to become, he would have a chance to become it, only if he survived. The emperor's last act toward his son was protective. Even now, even knowing what he was looking at when he looked at Commodus, he kept the boy safe. That's either the most heartbreaking thing in this story, or the most human, depending on how you look at it. Maybe it's both. His friends were at his bedside, worried men, grieving already. Men who had worked alongside him for decades and could not imagine the machine without its center, who were looking at the face of the man who had held the empire together by sheer force of philosophical discipline and wondering, quietly, desperately, what would happen when he was no longer holding it. He looked at them, these men who were grieving for him before he was gone. "Why do you grieve for me?" he said. "Think rather of the pestilence and the deaths of so many others." That is so completely him. Lying there at the edge of death, and what he offers his grieving friends is perspective, an invitation to step back, to see the larger picture. He was not being cruel. He was being himself, all the way to the end. The philosopher who had spent a lifetime trying to keep things in proportion was still at work, still doing the work, still tending the fire of his own practice, even as it was going out. He asked those around him not to make his death too important, not to collapse into it, to think of the larger canvas, the plague, the losses, the scale of what had already been. He was one man. He had lived a good life. He had done the work. He was going now, as everyone goes, and the river would continue. And then, and this is the line that has echoed across 19 centuries, he turned toward the tent's entrance, toward the dark beyond the camp's fires, and spoke his last words. Go to the rising sun. I am already setting. I have turned this sentence over in my mind for a long time, and what keeps striking me is the serenity of it. Not resignation, there is a difference. Resignation is what you feel when you've given up. Serenity is what you feel when you've accepted. Marcus Aurelius had spent 40 years preparing himself for this exact moment. Every night with the meditations, every exercise in perspective, every time he had climbed above the urgent noise of his life to see the river from above, every time he had written out, again in a tent like this one, that the universe's governance doesn't matter. What matters is how you show up. He had been practicing for this, and when the moment came, he had words for it, not borrowed words, his own. Go to the rising sun. I am already setting. He died within a day. The Senate, in a move that even by Roman standards was unusually swift, immediately declared him a god. He was deified the way only the greatest emperors were deified, not perfunctorily, not politically, but with something that seemed, even to the Romans, like genuine recognition. This was different. This was a man who had been something different. His ashes were carried back to Rome. They were placed in the mausoleum of Hadrian, the great round structure by the Tiber that we now call Castel Sant'Angelo, the castle of the Holy Angel, where they rest still, 2,000 years on, under the street traffic and the tourist photographs, and the modern city that has grown up around and over and through everything Rome once was. The sun had set on Marcus Aurelius, and then there is the gentler truth I want to leave you with tonight, the one that matters at this particular hour. Here's what I want you to take from Marcus tonight. You don't need to be an emperor to practice what he practiced. You just need to know that the fears keeping you awake right now, they live in your perceptions, not outside. They are not in the thing you're afraid of. They are in how you're holding the thing you're afraid of. And you can set them down. Maybe not forever, but tonight. Marcus practiced this every single night. Not because he'd solved fear, not because he was braver or stronger or further along than you are, but because he had learned that the practice was the point, that you don't wait to feel fearless before you act. You act first, and you write in your journal about it afterward, and maybe by morning it feels a little lighter, and the next night you do it again. You don't need to stop being afraid of what comes next. You just need to stop letting the fear decide what you do. You pick up the pen. You say your words. You face the morning. Marcus outlasted everything the world threw at him, not because he was fearless, but because he was faithful. Faithful to the practice. Faithful to the work. Faithful to the idea that even on the worst nights, even when the plague is in the camp and the empire is fraying, and the person you'd hoped your son would become is clearly not that person, even then, you sit down and you do the work on yourself. And then you sleep. And tomorrow the sun rises again. Marcus Aurelius was gone, but what he left behind was about to change the world. Here is perhaps the greatest irony in all of ancient history. Commodus, the son Marcus spent his entire reign trying to prepare, spent his own reign dismantling everything his father built. 13 years of it. He renamed Rome after himself. He wanted the city to be called Colonia Commodiana. He declared himself the reincarnation of Hercules and appeared in public wearing a lion skin. And if that sounds like the behavior of a man who had gone spectacularly off the rails, that is because it was. He executed senators on a whim. He spent his afternoons in the gladiatorial arena, which was not considered appropriate behavior for an emperor. And when his opponents were handicapped fighters and terrified animals rather than serious challengers, the crowd's enthusiasm was difficult to manufacture. He was assassinated on the last night of the year, 192 AD, which means the year ended with a strangled emperor and the Pax Romana, the 2 centuries of relative peace and stability that had culminated in Marcus's reign, dead along with him. Commodus did not outlast Rome. He barely outlasted his own name. Within years of his death, the memory of him was officially condemned, his statues toppled, his name struck from inscriptions. The Romans had a term for this, damnatio memoriae, the condemnation of memory. The official attempt to erase a person from history, as if the past itself could be edited. But here is what Commodus could not destroy, could not erase, could not even reach. Somewhere in the camps of the Danubian frontier, in the private possessions of a dead emperor, there were 12 small books, handwritten. In Greek, not Latin. Marcus had written in the language of his philosophical education rather than the language of his empire, as if creating a private space where the imperial machinery couldn't follow him. The books had no formal title. They were written to no one. Addressed, where addressed at all, to the writer himself. Notes for himself about himself. Marcus had called them, in the first book, something like To Himself. The title we use now, Meditations, was given centuries later by editors trying to make sense of what they'd found. Marcus would not have recognized it. He didn't have a title for the project because the project wasn't a project. It was a practice, like morning exercises or evening prayer, except more private than either. These 12 books were never meant to be read. Let that settle for a moment. The most influential philosophical text to emerge from ancient Rome, one of the foundational documents of Western ethics, a book that would shape the practice of modern psychotherapy and the leadership philosophy of emperors and presidents and generals across 19 centuries. It was written by a man who intended to throw it away, or at minimum, a man who never gave a moment's thought to its publication, because publication was not the point. The point was the doing of it, the writing, the returning to virtue, night after night, in the dark. How the meditation survived is not entirely clear. We know it was in private circulation by the 3rd century. We know a later emperor named Julian the Apostate was reading it. We know it passed through various collections, in various forms, across the chaos of the centuries that followed Rome's fall. At some point it crossed to the Eastern Empire, the Byzantine world, where Greek was still spoken and Roman philosophy still studied. And there it waited, in monastery libraries and palace archives, while the world it described became first ancient history, and then mythology, and then something almost beyond imagination. It was rediscovered, or rather recirculated, in the Renaissance. Printed for the first time in 1559 in Zurich, more than 1400 years after Marcus's death. A private journal had become, entirely against its author's intention, a public document. In 2019, more than 100,000 copies of the Meditations were sold in English alone, in a single year, by a man who never intended to publish it, in a language he never spoke, to an audience living in a world that would have seemed to him like something between a dream and a divine joke. But perhaps the strangest survival story belongs not to the book, but to the face. There is a bronze equestrian statue of Marcus Aurelius that stands, well, a cast of it stands, in the Piazza del Campidoglio in Rome, where Michelangelo himself redesigned the square in the 16th century specifically to display it. The original is now indoors, carefully preserved. It is one of the only surviving ancient bronze equestrian statues from the entire Roman world. Do you know why it survived? Because the medieval Christians who protected it thought it was a statue of the Emperor Constantine, the first Christian emperor, the man who legalized Christianity. They thought they were preserving a holy relic. They were actually preserving a pagan philosopher they likely would not have approved of. Marcus Aurelius survived the Middle Ages in disguise. His book survived because it was too private to be dangerous. His face survived because it was mistaken for someone else's. History has a sense of humor. Dry, dark, very long but present. The influence of the Meditations is almost impossible to trace completely because it is everywhere. Bill Clinton brought it on campaign trips and called it the book he returned to most often. The Chinese premier Wen Jiabao read it more than 100 times by his own account. Frederick the Great kept it in his military tent, which means there is a line of men reading private philosophical journals in military camps that goes straight from Marcus to the modern era without ever quite breaking. Theodore Roosevelt, Matthew Arnold. The list is very long. And then there is perhaps the most extraordinary legacy of all, one that most people don't know about, even when they've experienced it. In 1979, a psychiatrist named Aaron Beck formally published the theoretical framework for a new approach to treating anxiety and depression. He called it cognitive behavioral therapy. The core insight was this: emotional distress comes not from the events in our lives, but from the beliefs we hold about those events. The thought mediates the feeling. Change the thought, change the feeling. Beck explicitly acknowledged the ancient Stoics as his philosophical predecessors. He knew he was not inventing a new idea. He was translating into clinical language what Marcus Aurelius and Epictetus had been practicing for 2,000 years. The interpretations of events are the problem, not the events themselves, not the province of events, as Marcus would have put it, but the province of our response to them. The Meditations is, at its core, a manual of exactly what modern therapists teach in CBT. Identify the distorted thought, examine it, find the rational perspective, return to it repeatedly until it becomes habit. Marcus did this privately by himself in a tent for 20 years. Modern therapy has built a clinical practice around the same principle. You could leave life right now, Marcus wrote. let that determine what you do and say and think. The man who wrote that line never imagined a therapist's office. He never imagined the 20th century, the 21st century, the strange technological world where his journal would be read on glowing screens in quiet apartments in cities he never knew existed. He was writing for himself. And yet, what he wrote has kept company with more people in their dark hours than almost anything else the ancient world produced. He wrote in a language that wasn't his own, in a book that wasn't meant to be read, in a camp that no longer exists. And almost 2,000 years later, it's keeping you company tonight. There's one last thing I need to tell you. A long time ago. It feels like a long time ago now, doesn't it, though we've been traveling together? We started with a question. It was a simple question, the kind that sounds manageable until you look at it directly. How do you stop being afraid of what comes next? We asked it because it needed asking, because you already knew the feeling the question was pointing at. The specific weight of the future pressing down, not vague dread, but something more specific and more alive. The fear that the next thing will be the thing you can't handle. That you have been managing, building, holding together some version of your life, and out there in the dark there is something waiting that will be too much, too heavy, too fast, too final. And we followed Marcus Aurelius into that question. All the way through his life, and his wars and his plague and his grief, and his private journal written by candlelight in a military camp at the edge of the world. So now I owe you the answer. Except the answer is not what you might have expected. Because Marcus Aurelius, who spent 40 years more directly confronted by that question than almost any human being who has ever lived, emperor, philosopher, father, widower, plague survivor, general amateur astronomer, reluctant god, Marcus Aurelius did not discover how to stop being afraid. He discovered something better. He discovered how to act anyway. You could leave life right now, he wrote. Let that determine what you do and say and think. This is one of the strangest, most clarifying sentences in the Meditations, and I want you to hear it correctly, because it is very easy to mishear it. He is not being morbid. He is not counseling despair. He is not suggesting that life is so fragile that you should be paralyzed by its fragility. He is saying the opposite. He's saying you could leave at any moment. This is true. You always could. Every morning you wake up is a morning that was not guaranteed. Every conversation you have is one that might not have happened. The whole structure of the future that you're afraid of getting wrong, afraid of not surviving, afraid of being unequal to, is built on a foundation that has never been promised to you. You are already living beyond the guarantee. And knowing that, sitting with that, not flinching from it, not comforting yourself with false permanence, knowing that should free you. Because if you are already living in the space beyond guarantee, what exactly are you protecting yourself from? The future is uncertain. It will arrive whether you worry about it or not. It will ask things of you that you cannot yet anticipate. And you will either show up when it calls, or you won't. But the fear doesn't help you show up. Fear is a liar that tells you it's preparing you, when mostly it's just burning your energy on futures that don't exist yet and may never exist. Fear takes you out of the present moment, which is the only moment in which anything has ever actually been done, and puts you in a dark room full of contingencies. Marcus knew this. He struggled with it his whole life. He wrote himself back from it 9 times, or 90 times, or 900 times. He was not a man who defeated fear. He was a man who refused to let fear hold the pen. Think of yourself as dead, he wrote in another place. You have lived your life. Now take what's left and live it properly. This is the move. This is the stoic pivot that Marcus came back to again and again. Not optimism, not the cheerful insistence that things will work out fine, that the future is bright, that your fears are unfounded. Marcus was not a man for false comfort. He lived in a world where the fears were usually well-founded. The plague was real. The barbarians were real. The crumbling empire was real. His grief was real. The future he was afraid of often arrived, and it was exactly as hard as he'd feared. But he was still here. He was still at the desk, still holding the pen, still writing his way through the darkness, one sentence at a time. The identity shift Marcus offers is not from "I am afraid" to "I am fearless." That shift is a fantasy, and Marcus was too honest for fantasies. The shift he offers is from "I am afraid, therefore I cannot act" to "I am afraid, and I am acting." Both things at once. The fear acknowledged, the action chosen anyway. Because here is what Marcus understood about fear that the fear doesn't want you to understand. Fear has no authority. It has enormous presence. It can fill a room, fill a life, fill a night, but it has no authority. It cannot actually stop you from doing the thing. It can make you believe it can stop you. It can make the cost of acting feel impossibly high. But it cannot open your hands and take the pen away. That's still your choice. And every night Marcus sat down in that tent. Tired, grieving, sick, afraid of the barbarians and the plague, and the question of whether his son would destroy everything he'd built. Every night he sat down anyway and opened the book and picked up the pen and argued with himself and wrote himself back toward virtue, and woke the next morning still afraid but still there, still at the post, still doing the work. For 20 years. That is the answer to the question. You don't stop being afraid of what comes next. You stop letting the fear make the decisions. You show up anyway. You pick up the pen. You write your way through the darkness. And if you do it long enough, you discover something extraordinary. Not that the fear is gone. It's never quite gone. But that you are larger than the fear. That you have been carrying it, living inside it, writing by its light, and it has not destroyed you. You are still here. The sun is still rising, and you are, against all the odds the fear has been quoting at you for years, still intact. That's not the triumph of fearlessness. That's something quieter and more durable. That's the discovery of your own resilience, made in the dark, without any guarantee of the morning. And maybe that's the real question Marcus left us with, not whether we can stop being afraid. We can't. But whether we can still act, still love, still show up, even when we are. I think we can. I think he showed us we can. He showed up every night. In one of the most demanding lives in the history of the ancient world, surrounded by death and crisis and the endless grinding weight of responsibility for millions of lives, he still found the tent, the lamp, the pen, and the page. He still argued himself back toward goodness. He still held himself accountable to an ideal that he couldn't always meet, but never stopped pursuing. He was afraid of the future. He carried the fear all the way to Vindobona. He carried it to the end, and he set it down beautifully. So here we are. The fire has burned low. The camp is quiet. The river is still flowing, somewhere outside, the way rivers do, indifferent to our schedules and our worries and our need for things to pause while we catch our breath. We spent a long time tonight with 5 adversaries. The Danube frontier, where the barbarian pressure never let up. Where Marcus spent 11 years in the cold and the mud and the stench of death trying to hold a line he hadn't chosen and couldn't abandon. The Antonine plague, which took somewhere between 5 and 10 million lives, and moved through the empire like a slow, deliberate argument against the idea that virtue protects you from suffering. Commodus, his son, the shadow hanging over everything Marcus built, the living proof that you can do everything right as a parent and still not control what the child becomes. His own grief, for the children who died before him, for the wife who died before him, for the self he wanted to be that the empire kept making impossible. And his own mind, most formidable of all, the war in the tent, by the lamplight, in the 12 books that were never meant to be read. He outlasted all 5. Not by defeating them, not by becoming someone they couldn't touch. He outlasted them by refusing to let them close the book. The plague took his people but not his practice. The barbarians pressed on his borders but not on his integrity. Commodus would eventually undo the empire, but couldn't undo what Marcus had written. Grief visited him again and again, but never settled permanently enough to stop the pen. And his own worst thoughts, the doubt, the fear, the middle-of-the-night certainty that he was not equal to what was being asked of him. He met those every night and met them honestly and kept writing anyway. His greatest act was not winning the Marcomannic Wars. It was not holding the Danube. It was not the 19 years of careful, principled administration that kept the empire functioning through an unprecedented plague. Those are remarkable achievements, and they should not be diminished. But his greatest act was smaller and quieter than any of them. It was picking up the journal in the tent in the dark, when no one was watching and nothing required it, when he could have slept, when he would have been forgiven for sleeping, when the empire would have survived just as well, if he'd closed his eyes and let tomorrow take care of itself. He didn't. He picked up the pen. He argued with himself. He talked himself back from the edge, or toward the edge when the edge needed visiting, or along the edge when that's where he had to walk. He kept the record of a man trying, imperfectly and persistently, to be good. And 2,000 years later, in the quiet of a night you did not expect to end up spending with a Roman emperor, that private argument is keeping you company. His insomnia is holding space for yours. His 3 a.m. questions are sitting with your 3 a.m. questions. His voice, translated and retranslated, and carried forward across 19 centuries of copying and printing and carrying, is here with you right now. The secret takeaway, the one I want you to carry into your sleep tonight, the one I hope finds you again tomorrow morning, is this: you are not behind. You are not failing to be brave enough. You are not doing it wrong because the fear is still there. Marcus Aurelius, emperor, philosopher, the most powerful man on earth in his time, and possibly the most reflective, was afraid too. He wrote about it to himself, with no audience and no applause, for 20 years. And he kept going. So can you. You were afraid of the future when tonight began. Maybe you still are. Maybe that's fine. The fear and the action can both live in you. They lived in him. He carried them both all the way to Vindobona. And when it came time for his last sentence, what he said was not, "I was never afraid." What he said was, "Go to the rising sun. I am already setting." He knew where he was in the river. He made peace with it. He let it carry him. That's not defeat. That is the most extraordinary kind of courage. Not the absence of fear, but the decision to be larger than it. To hold it without being held by it. To set it down tonight like something that served its purpose and can now be released. The river is still flowing. The sun is still rising somewhere. And so are you. Since you made it this far, I'm glad you enjoyed the episode. If you would like to continue listening to episodes with similar themes, I linked them in the description below. You will also find a playlist of our most popular videos. Sleep now, nightlings, and wake up, as always, a little stronger and a little wiser. The story is done, but yours continues.